Waukesha, November 2021. Hot cocoa, diesel, the rhythmic pulse of a marching band. Then, the rhythm breaks. A red SUV, cold, mechanical, relentless, tears through the barricades at 40 miles per hour. It does not swerve for the children. It does not brake for the elderly. In seconds, festive brass is silenced by the sickening thud of metal against bone. This was no failure of mechanics. This was the roar of a man using 4,000 pounds of steel to settle a petty, narcissistic score. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the carnage of that November afternoon, one must first look at the 50-page ledger of failures that preceded it. Darrell Brooks Jr. was not a ghost in the system. He was a frequent flyer. By the time he reached the age of 39, his life was less a biography and more a revolving door of courthouse corridors and cinder-block cells. His criminal record stretched across 3 decades and multiple states: Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, leaving behind a trail of victims that the legal system seemed to forget as quickly as it processed them. It began in the late 90s, a steady drumbeat of aggravated battery, carrying concealed weapons and drug possession. In Nevada, he was a registered sex offender, a title earned after a 2006 conviction for statutory sexual seduction. In Georgia, there were more batteries, more arrests for obstructing officers. Back in Wisconsin, the record grew thick with counts of bail jumping and reckless endangerment. He was a man who viewed the law not as a boundary, but as a suggestion, a nuisance to be bypassed with a sob story or a procedural oversight. But Brooks didn't see himself as a career criminal. In his mind, he was a star waiting for a stage. Under the moniker Math Boy Fly, he attempted to carve out a career in the Milwaukee rap scene. His music videos, produced on a shoestring budget, were a window into a hollow, narcissistic world. In these videos, he postured with stacks of cash and jewelry, projecting an image of power and street-level authority. But looking back at those frames today, there is a chilling, prophetic detail that stands out. In the background of his performances, parked casually on the street, sat the red Ford Escape. The same vehicle that would eventually become a weapon of mass casualty was, for months, merely a prop in his fantasies of fame. It was a utilitarian vessel for a man who believed the world owed him a spotlight, no matter who he had to climb over to reach it. The most damning chapter of his history, however, was written just 20 days before the parade. On November 2nd, Brooks was arrested for a series of violent acts that should have kept him behind bars indefinitely. He was accused of punching the mother of his child in the face, and then, with a cold-blooded lack of hesitation, running her over with that same red SUV in a gas station parking lot. It was a dry run for the massacre to come. He was charged with second-degree recklessly endangering safety, felony bail jumping, and battery. Then the system broke. Despite his violent history, despite the fact that he was already out on bail for a different case involving a firearm, a Milwaukee County Assistant District Attorney requested a bail of just $1,000. It was a sum so inappropriately low that even the district attorney's office would later call it a mistake. It was a clerical error that functioned as a death warrant for the citizens of Waukesha. On November 11th, Brooks scraped together the cash and walked out of the Milwaukee County Jail. He was a free man, fueled by the knowledge that he could crush a human being under his tires and be back on the street for the price of a used motor scooter. Friends and family described his state of mind in the following days as a ticking clock, a man perpetually on the edge of a domestic explosion. He was living in that red SUV, parked outside his mother's house, a cramped and airless space where his resentment could fester. He was broke, he was angry, and he felt the walls closing in. He didn't have a plan to attack a parade. He didn't have the discipline for a grand conspiracy. Instead, he possessed something far more volatile, a complete lack of empathy coupled with an explosive, hair-trigger temper. He was a man who saw every inconvenience as an assault on his ego, and he was prepared to retaliate with everything he had left. The air in Wisconsin was turning sharp as the holiday season approached. In Waukesha, families were untangling strings of lights and practicing their instrumentals. They were preparing for a tradition of joy. Darrell Brooks, meanwhile, was sitting in a red Ford Escape, staring at the dashboard, waiting for a reason to snap. The spark that would eventually ignite the center of Waukesha didn't start with a political grievance or a calculated plot. It started in the suffocating, repetitive cycle of a toxic relationship. To understand why Darrell Brooks turned his steering wheel toward a crowd of children, one must understand the 15-year tether between him and Erica Patterson, a bond forged not in affection, but in the relentless gravity of domestic control. Erica had spent over a decade as the primary target of Brooks's internal storms. Their history was a map of bruises and broken promises, stretching from the suburbs of Georgia to the cold streets of Milwaukee. She was the mother of his child, but in the twisted architecture of Brooks' mind, she was more of a possession, a metric by which he measured his own power. When he felt small, he made sure she felt smaller. When the world ignored his math boy fly persona, he ensured Erica acknowledged his dominance with her silence or her scars. The relationship had reached a lethal crescendo just weeks prior at a local gas station, where he had allegedly used the very same red Ford Escape to knock her to the pavement. That incident had landed him in a cell, but thanks to the catastrophic bail oversight, he was back in her orbit by late November. He hadn't used his freedom to find a job or seek help. He had used it to resume his hunt. He was living out of the SUV, a cramped, mobile headquarters for his resentment, frequently parking near where Erica stayed, watching, waiting for the inevitable friction of their next encounter. The morning of November 21st, 2021, began with the kind of biting Wisconsin cold that turns the breath into a ghost. Brooks was on edge. He was broke, he was hungry, and his ego was brittle. He began blowing up Erica's phone, a digital barrage of demands and accusations. He wanted to meet. He claimed he had things to discuss, but the subtext was always the same. He needed to assert his presence. Erica, perhaps hoping that a public setting would offer a shield, agreed to meet him at Frame Park, a scenic 60-acre stretch of greenery nestled along the Fox River. By mid-afternoon, the park was a snapshot of suburban peace. Families were walking dogs, and the distant, muffled sound of the high school marching bands warming up for the parade could be heard drifting on the wind from the downtown area, just 3/4 of a mile away. Brooks arrived in the red SUV, the engine idling with a low, mechanical growl that felt out of place against the quiet of the riverbank. When Erica arrived, the discussion dissolved almost instantly into the familiar rhythm of a domestic ambush. Brooks wasn't there to talk. He was there to extort. He demanded that Erica hand over her phone, or perhaps give him money he felt he was owed. The specifics of the petty argument mattered less than the escalating volume of his rage. He cornered her near the vehicle, his posture aggressive, his movements jagged. Witnesses later described the scene as a man possessed by a specific localized fury. He allegedly struck her again, the physical exclamation point to his verbal assault. But on this day, the cycle broke in a way Brooks hadn't anticipated. Erica didn't retreat into the usual submissive silence. She pulled away. She sought out her friends who were nearby, and together they did the one thing Brooks could not tolerate. They challenged his authority by reaching for a phone to call the authorities. The 911 call from Frame Park was placed at approximately 4:35 p.m. Erica's friends reported a domestic disturbance, describing a man in a red SUV who had just assaulted a woman. For Brooks, this was the ultimate disrespect. In his narcissistic worldview, calling the police wasn't a search for safety. It was a personal betrayal, a conspiracy to put him back in the cage he had just escaped. As he saw Erica retreating toward the safety of others and realized the sirens would soon be converging on his location, the last of his impulse control evaporated. He didn't just drive away from Frame Park, he exploded out of it. He slammed the Ford Escape into gear, the tires spitting gravel as he tore onto the residential streets. He was vibrating with a specific, white-hot kind of anger, the kind that looks for a target, any target, to absorb the weight of his frustration. He was a man who felt the world was closing in on him, and in his mind, the world deserved to feel his impact. The geography of the next few minutes is hauntingly simple. From Frame Park, the most direct escape route to the west leads directly toward the heart of Waukesha's downtown. As he sped away from the domestic dispute, He wasn't looking for a highway or a hiding spot. He was looking for a way to scream at a world that refused to see him as he saw himself. He turned the wheel, navigating the quiet blocks where families had recently left their homes to find a spot on the curb. He began to bypass the initial police cordons, driving over lawns and around barricades with a reckless disregard for the suburban landscape. The sounds of the parade were getting louder now, the rhythmic thumping of the drums, the cheers of the crowd, the high-pitched excitement of children waiting for candy. Most people, seeing a red SUV barreling toward a closed-off street, would assume the driver was lost or confused. But Brooks wasn't lost. He was focused. He saw the crowds as an extension of the system that was trying to hold him accountable. He saw the joy of the parade as an insult to his own misery. As he approached the intersection of White Rock Avenue and East Main Street, the transition was complete. He had moved from a domestic abuser fleeing a park to something far more incomprehensible. He pushed the accelerator down, the engine of the Ford Escape roaring as it crested the hill. Ahead of him lay a river of people, high school musicians in uniform, elderly dancers in festive outfits, and thousands of spectators packed 6 deep on the sidewalks. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look for a side street. He saw the humanity in front of him not as lives, but as obstacles to his flight and targets for his rage. The spark had traveled from a petty argument in a park to the throttle of a 2-ton weapon. He was no longer just Darrell Brooks. He was a kinetic force of narcissistic collapse, and the center of Waukesha was about to become his crash site. At 4:39 p.m., Main Street in Waukesha was a canyon of brick, limestone, and concentrated holiday spirit. The air was a crisp 38 degrees, sharp enough to make the spectators pull their scarves tighter, but not cold enough to dampen the enthusiasm of the thousands lined up along the curb. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the pavement, while the multicolored LED strings on the storefronts began to twinkle with artificial warmth. To the families on the sidewalk, the world felt orderly, rhythmic, safe. The parade was moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a community tradition. There were the Golden Agers, a group of seniors celebrating the longevity of their friendships. There were the Milwaukee Dancing Grannies, women who had spent decades finding joy in synchronized movements and white pom-poms. Behind them, the Waukesha South High School Marching Band provided the heartbeat of the afternoon, their brass instruments gleaming under the streetlights as they played On Wisconsin. It was a scene of fragile, human precision, a moment where the only thing that mattered was the next step, the next note, and the next handful of candy thrown to a child in a parka. Then, the dissonance began. At the intersection of White Rock Avenue and East Main Street, a police officer stood by a line of plastic barricades. He heard it before he saw it, the mechanical whine of an engine being pushed to its limit. A red Ford Escape, its hood slightly crumpled from a previous encounter, bypassed the officer's outstretched hand. The officer later recounted how he shouted for the vehicle to stop, his voice lost in the roar of the exhaust. He even pounded on the hood as the SUV slowed for a split second, long enough for the driver to acknowledge the uniform, before the tires found traction and the vehicle surged forward into the restricted zone. The red SUV didn't just enter the parade route, it hunted it. As the vehicle accelerated onto Main Street, the festive atmosphere didn't vanish instantly. It curdled. For the first block, many spectators remained frozen, their brains refusing to process the anomaly of a 4,000-pound machine moving through a pedestrian corridor. They assumed it was a lost driver, a security vehicle, or part of a stunt. But the lack of brake lights told a different story. The red Ford Escape began to pick up speed, 20, 30, 40 miles per hour. It was a blur of crimson metal against a backdrop of tinsel. The first major impact occurred near the intersection of Main and Barstow. The Milwaukee Dancing Grannies were in the middle of a routine, their backs turned to the oncoming terror. Witnesses described the sound as something visceral, not a crash of metal, but a series of dull, wet thuds. The SUV didn't swerve to avoid the women in their blue vests. It plowed directly through the center of the formation. Pom-poms were kicked into the air like confetti. Bodies were thrown into the air. falling onto the cold asphalt with a finality that silenced the nearby cheers. Brooks didn't slow down. He didn't check the rearview mirror. He leaned on the horn, a long, agonizing blast that served not as a warning, but as a claim of dominance. The carnage moved down the street like a shockwave. As the SUV approached the high school marching band, the musicians were mid-measure. The tubas and trombones muffled the sound of the engine until the vehicle was mere feet away. The driver began to zigzag. This was the detail that would later haunt investigators. The swerving. He wasn't trying to find a clear path. He was aiming for the densest clusters of people. He veered toward a group of children from the Waukesha Blazers baseball team. These were boys no older than 10 or 11, wearing their jerseys over heavy sweatshirts, clutching plastic buckets for candy. The SUV struck them with the force of a battering ram. Parents on the sidelines described the scene as a sudden, horrific transformation of the landscape. One moment, their children were laughing. The next, they were scattered across the street like discarded dolls. The smell of the afternoon changed instantly. The scent of pine and popcorn was replaced by the acrid stench of burning rubber and the copper tang of blood on cold pavement. The high school band's music stopped, replaced by a symphony of screams and the frantic, rhythmic blowing of police whistles. Officers along the route began to realize that this was an intentional act of mass casualty. One detective, positioned near a storefront, drew his service weapon as the red SUV barreled toward him. He waited for a clear window, a moment where a shot wouldn't risk hitting a spectator, and fired 3 rounds into the vehicle's side. The glass of the driver's side window shattered, but the car didn't falter. It only seemed to go faster, the engine screaming as it shifted gears, the undercarriage occasionally sparking as it dragged debris, and in some cases, clothing beneath it. Brooks continued his frantic path for 5 long blocks. At each intersection, the horror was reenacted for a new group of spectators. He drove over lawn chairs, he smashed through strollers. He left a trail of crumpled brass instruments and holiday banners in his wake. The Waukesha Extreme Dance Team, a group of young girls, was hit next. The sight was surreal, sparkling costumes and sequins flying through the air, followed by a silence so profound it felt as though the entire city had held its breath. By the time the SUV reached the end of the main parade stretch, the vehicle was a mess of mechanical failure and human evidence. The front grille was gone. The hood was buckled upward, obstructing the driver's view, yet he continued to navigate by looking through the gaps in the metal. He turned off Main Street, bouncing over a curb and tearing through a final set of barricades, the red metal disappearing into the darkening residential side streets. Back on Main Street, the world had ended. 6 people were dead or dying, including an 8-year-old boy who had been there to see the lights. More than 60 others lay broken on the ground, their injuries ranging from shattered limbs to traumatic brain damage. The Dancing Grannies, a group that symbolized the soul of the community, had been decimated. The parade route was now a triage center. Strangers used holiday scarves as tourniquets. High school students, still in their band uniforms, knelt in the street to hold the hands of the dying. The festive lights continued to twinkle, indifferent to the blood pooling around the base of the lampposts. Darrell Brooks had finished his performance. He had taken his internal, narcissistic rage and projected it onto the most vulnerable target he could find. He had turned a celebration into a cemetery in less than 5 minutes, leaving a city to bleed out in the cold Wisconsin twilight while he drove into the shadows, looking for a way to save himself from the consequences he had just manufactured. The red Ford Escape was no longer a vehicle. It was a dying mechanical animal, gasping for air as it lurched away from the screams of Main Street. The front end was a mangled grimace of plastic and steel, the radiator hissing steam into the freezing night air. Every revolution of the tires was accompanied by the rhythmic scraping of the undercarriage against the pavement, a sound like a serrated knife dragging across stone. Darrell Brooks was navigating by instinct now, turning the wheel with frantic, jerky movements, desperate to put a maze of residential architecture between himself and the flashing blue lights. He didn't go far. He couldn't. Less than a mile from the epicenter of the carnage, he turned onto Elizabeth Street, a quiet, narrow corridor of modest homes and manicured lawns. He pulled the SUV into a random driveway, the engine giving one final shuddering gasp before falling silent. The sudden absence of the roar was jarring, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, haunting echo of sirens converging on the downtown area. Brooks didn't panic with noise. He panicked with a cold, calculated silence. He stepped out of the vehicle, leaving the door slightly ajar, and began to shed the evidence of his presence. He ditched his sweatshirt, hoping to transform from the Math Boy Fly caricature seen in the parade footage into a nondescript, shivering bystander. The manhunt began as a chaotic scramble of fragmented information. In the first 20 minutes, the Waukesha Police Department was operating in a vacuum of terror. Dispatchers were overwhelmed with calls describing a war zone. Early reports suggested a possible sniper or a second vehicle. There was a fear that the SUV was rigged with explosives. The city was placed under an immediate, suffocating lockdown. While officers were kneeling in the blood on Main Street to perform CPR, others were fanning out into the surrounding neighborhoods, their boots pounding on the pavement, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like desperate searchlights. Brooks, meanwhile, was playing the role of a victim. He began walking through the backyards of Elizabeth Street, his breath hitching in the cold. He was looking for a way in, a door, a window, a moment of human weakness he could exploit. He eventually found his way to the porch of a local resident named Daniel Ryder. To Ryder, who was sitting in his living room, unaware that his town had just become the site of a massacre, the man at the door looked like a soul in distress. Brooks looked small. He looked cold. He stood there with his arms wrapped around himself, his voice trembling as he told a story of a life in transition. He told Ryder that he was homeless. He claimed he was waiting for an Uber to take him to a safe place, but that the driver was lost in the neighborhood's confusing layout. It was a performance rooted in the same narcissism that drove him onto the parade route, the belief that he could manipulate anyone at any time to serve his immediate needs. Ryder, moved by a sense of neighborly compassion, invited the stranger onto his porch. He didn't see the blood on the man's shoes. He didn't see the jagged adrenaline behind the man's eyes. Instead, Ryder went into his kitchen and prepared a ham and cheese sandwich. He brought out a jacket to shield Brooks from the Wisconsin frost. For several minutes, the two men sat in a surreal bubble of normalcy. Brooks ate the sandwich with a frantic hunger, his eyes darting toward the street every time a siren wailed in the distance. He kept checking his phone, pretending to coordinate with a ride that didn't exist, while just blocks away, the bodies of the elderly and the young were being loaded into ambulances. The bubble burst when Ryder looked out his window and saw a phalanx of police cruisers screaming down Elizabeth Street. The officers had found the SUV. They saw the crumpled hood and the shattered glass. They were now moving house to house with their weapons drawn, their focus narrowing on the specific block where the red Ford Escape sat like a discarded shell. Ryder, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, told Brooks he needed to leave. Brooks didn't argue. He stepped back into the night, but the world had already caught up to him. At approximately 5:25 p.m., a Waukesha police officer spotted a lone figure walking near the sidewalk. The man matched the description that was beginning to circulate. A black male in a light-colored t-shirt, looking out of place in the sub-zero wind chill. The apprehension was surprisingly quiet. There was no high-speed chase, no final stand. When the officers converged on him, Brooks didn't fight. He didn't scream. He surrendered with the practiced submissiveness of a man who had been through the system dozens of times before. He was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, the metal door clicking shut on his freedom for the final time. While Brooks was being transported to the precinct, Waukesha was still a city in the grip of a nervous breakdown. The search for other suspects continued for hours as tactical teams cleared buildings and searched the riverbanks. The local hospital was a scene of industrial-scale trauma, with doctors and nurses being called in from across the state to handle the influx of broken bodies. Families were still wandering the streets, some clutching single shoes or holiday banners, looking for children they had lost in the stampede. The manhunt was over, but the search for a motive was just beginning. As the detectives began their initial interrogation, they found a man who seemed more concerned about the cold and his own discomfort than the trail of death he had left behind. He was a man who had already begun to distance himself from the act, retreating into a shell of denial that would eventually define one of the most bizarre legal battles in American history. The red SUV sat in a tow yard, a silent witness to the carnage, while Darrell Brooks sat in a concrete room, already beginning to craft the next version of his own reality. Inside the interrogation room of the Waukesha Police Department, the air was heavy with the smell of wet pavement and industrial-grade floor cleaner. Detective Thomas Carpenter and Detective Jay Casey sat across from the man who had, only hours before, decimated the heart of their city. The world outside was a cacophony of sirens and breaking news bulletins, with national headlines speculating on a possible act of domestic terrorism. But inside these 4 cinder-block walls, the scale of the tragedy felt suffocatingly small and intimate. The detectives began the interview with a calculated, low-key approach, looking to peel back the layers of Darrell Brooks' carefully constructed facade. Initially, Brooks played the part of the confused wanderer. He sat hunched over, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, complaining about the cold and expressing concern for his family. He claimed he had no knowledge of any parade. He spoke of being in the area to find a friend, weaving a disorganized narrative of homelessness and bad luck. But as the minutes ticked by and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the detectives began to introduce the weight of the evidence they had already gathered. The first crack in his story was the 911 call from Frame Park. The detectives informed him that they knew exactly where he had been at 4:35 p.m. and exactly what he had done to Erica Patterson. They described the red Ford Escape sitting in the impound lot, the vehicle that was registered to his mother but currently held the mechanical and biological fingerprints of his rage. When confronted with the timeline, Brooks shifted his tactics. He didn't confess. Instead, he began to suggest that the car had a life of its own. He spoke of mechanical failures and honking the horn to warn people, an admission that placed him behind the wheel while simultaneously attempting to absolve him of intent. It was a narcissistic pivot, admitting to the act only to frame himself as a victim of circumstance. While the interrogation continued, a secondary investigation was unfolding at the scene. Forensics teams were working under massive portable floodlights, meticulously documenting a trail of evidence that stretched for nearly a mile. They found more than just debris. They found a key to a Ford vehicle in Brooks' pocket at the time of his arrest. They found red fibers on his clothing that matched the upholstery of the SUV. Most chillingly, they analyzed the vehicle's black box, the event data recorder. The data was indisputable. It showed that at no point during the 5-block massacre did the driver apply the brakes. In fact, the throttle had been depressed repeatedly. The vehicle hadn't malfunctioned, it had been steered. As the detectives transitioned from the why to the who, the room became a gallery of the fallen. They began to read the names of the dead, the grandmothers, the young boy, the pillars of the community. They watched Brooks' face for a flicker of humanity, but they found only a deepening, combative resentment. He didn't ask about the victims' families. He didn't ask if the children would survive. Instead, he began to cry, not for the lives he had ended, but for himself. He lamented the unfairness of his situation, suggesting that the police were merely looking for a scapegoat. It was during this period of pre-trial detention that the investigation took a surreal and exhausting turn. Brooks began to pivot away from a traditional legal defense and toward the sovereign citizen movement, a fringe pseudo-legal ideology that claims the government is a corporation and the law does not apply to living souls. This wasn't just a change in strategy, it was an attempt to dismantle the very reality of the courtroom. He began to demand verified proof of claim and refused to acknowledge his own name, insisting he was a third-party intervener for the person Darrell Brooks. This sovereign pivot created a logistical nightmare for the Waukesha County District Attorney's Office. Detectives had to spend hundreds of hours preparing for a defendant who intended to turn the trial into a circus of procedural interruptions. Brooks spent his days in his cell surrounded by stacks of law books and yellow legal pads, constructing a fort of cardboard boxes to shield himself from the view of the guards. He was preparing to represent himself, a move that the prosecution realized would force the victims to face their attacker directly on the stand. Outside the legal bubble, the community of Waukesha was undergoing a transformation of its own. The initial shock had hardened into a resilient collective identity known as Waukesha Strong. The investigation was no longer just about a criminal case. It was a communal accounting of grief. Rumors had initially swirled about a second driver or a targeted political hit, but as the police released more information, the town had to grapple with the truth that was much harder to digest: that a man had killed their neighbors simply because he was angry at a woman in a park. The detectives eventually wrapped up their final interviews, leaving Brooks to sit in the silence of his cell. They had the DNA, they had the data from the car, they had the footage from a dozen different angles showing his face behind the shattered windshield. The investigation was airtight, yet the sovereign pivot suggested that the road to justice would be long, loud, and intentionally painful. Brooks wasn't just a murderer in the eyes of the law. He was an insurgent against the very concept of order, and he intended to make the community of Waukesha pay for their resilience by forcing them to endure his presence one more time. The case was no longer a search for a perpetrator. It was a battle for the dignity of the dead. As the trial date approached, the detectives and the families of Waukesha braced themselves for a spectacle of narcissistic defiance, knowing that while they had the truth, Darrell Brooks still held the power to disrupt the peace he had already stolen. The 2022 trial transformed into a theater of the absurd, a final desperate attempt at dominance. Darrell Brooks, having dismissed his legal counsel, stood alone, a man draped in an oversized suit and a veil of legal gibberish. He turned the proceedings into a grueling endurance test for the survivors. He argued with the judge over her own authority. He hid behind a fortress of cardboard files. He cross-examined those he had broken with a chilling, detached arrogance, often forcing them to relive their trauma while he played the part of the persecuted intellectual. But the sovereign citizen scripts couldn't drown out the evidence. The jury saw through the smoke. They returned 76 guilty verdicts, one for every life he touched with his bumper. At sentencing, the judge spared no words. She spoke of the utter lack of remorse, the sheer scale of evil, and then she delivered the finality the city demanded. Over 700 years, consecutive, life after life after life. He will never touch the grass of a park again. Today, Main Street has been repaved and the lights twinkle once more. But the silence in Waukesha carries a weight that no parade can ever truly lift. It is a silence held for the grandmothers who will never dance again, and the children whose laughter was stolen by a man who couldn't handle his own smallness. The red SUV is a memory of metal and malice, but the city's strength is the reality that remains. A community is not defined by the one who tries to break it, but by the hands that reach out to help. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Daniel Callahan was born on September 13th, 1987 in the state of Mississippi. He was the oldest of 3 children. All the children had different fathers, so their mother, mired in the search for phantom happiness, could in no way serve as a role model. The woman constantly entered into toxic relationships with different men. Many of them were dependent on prohibited substances or abused alcohol. That is, they were real monsters who never missed an opportunity to humiliate or hit. The mother did not care at all about her children and their well-being. Because of constant problems with the law and money, the family moved from place to place. In 1 year, the children changed 12 schools. By that time, chaos was already reigning in the children's heads. They did not even have time to remember the names of new teachers before they had to pack their things again. However, the moves were not the worst thing. Their life was a real waking nightmare. Daniel and his younger brother and sister not only witnessed the brutal beatings of their mother by her drunken partners, but they themselves were often subjected to verbal humiliation and physical violence. The mother, having suffered from another tormentor, often took out her anger and resentment on her own children, lashing out at them for the slightest offense, or even without any reason because they got under her hot hand. The nightmare was further aggravated by the fact that Daniel was often subjected to lewd acts and molestation by one of the relatives, who took advantage of the boy's lack of supervision. The mother knew about this perfectly well. She saw everything with her own eyes, but did nothing. She remained silent, fearing to be left completely alone, or she was so deeply absorbed in her own personal problems that she did not care. She simply did not have the resources to protect her son. Daniel's childhood could not be called happy, even with a stretch. The children were not so much raised as they simply survived in conditions of total chaos, domestic cruelty, constant instability, and a complete lack of safety and comfort. They were constantly forgotten to be fed, not taken to school, and not bought warm clothes. They were simply neglected, left alone with the monsters who were supposed to be their family. Daniel's biological father was even worse than the mother. Wayne Drott was a murderer and a psychopath. At a music festival in New Orleans, Wayne met an 18-year-old girl, kidnapped her, beat her to death, and dumped her body in the river, then fled the scene of the crime. The body was found 3 weeks later. Fortunately, Drott was caught and arrested. The court sentenced him to 25 years in prison. But the story did not end there, because 4 years later, Daniel's father escaped from prison and kidnapped another 17-year-old girl who worked as a saleswoman in a store. Together with the captive, the man headed to Arkansas. He hid with her for more than 15 hours until the police caught up with them. A chase began. Daniel's father stopped the car and opened fire on law enforcement officers. The girl took advantage of the moment and jumped out of the vehicle. Thanks to a lucky coincidence, she survived. A shootout ensued between Daniel's father and the police. Eventually, he was surrounded, and he realized that he could not escape. Realizing the inevitability of arrest and a life sentence, Drott turned the pistol on himself and left this world. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Wayne Drott's story looked more like a crime drama. However, the mother did not hide the terrible truth from her 7-year-old son and told Daniel what his dad had done. The fact that his biological father was a murderer severely traumatized Daniel's psyche. In addition, his mother repeatedly insisted that he would become just like his dad when he grew up. Considering what Daniel Callahan did later, this looked like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Literally from a young age, the mother planted in her son's head the idea that one day he would become a murderer, and it happened. At the age of 13, Daniel and the other children were finally taken away from their mother's custody and placed in foster families. Although the brother and sister were separated, it was better than remaining under the supervision of a woman who did not care at all about the well-being of her own children. Little is known about Daniel's upbringing in the foster family, but in his teenage years, he had to face many difficulties that only worsened over the years. Serious problems with the law began as soon as Daniel reached adulthood. Apparently, his mother's words that he would repeat his father's path were firmly lodged in his head. In 2006, at the age of 19, Daniel Callahan was arrested for burglary and other minor offenses. In 2008, he was detained for assault on family members and theft. Together with another relative, Callahan was charged with causing bodily harm with a glass jar. In 2009, he was arrested again for theft and illegal breaking into a vehicle. Daniel even stole from his own mother, but she did not press charges. Eventually, Callahan was sentenced to 12 years in prison. However, he got off scot-free again. Despite numerous arrests, the sentence was suspended. Although Daniel could now be considered a professional criminal, in 2008 he did something unexpected. He got married. His chosen one was a woman named Amber Boyd, who was a year older than him. It was a sudden decision that led to nothing good. The husband, who at first seemed to Amber like salvation and hope for a better life, very quickly turned into hell. Daniel displayed not just a hot-tempered character, but sadistic cruelty. He treated his wife terribly, humiliated, and insulted her at every opportunity, and also regularly raised his hand against her, taking out his anger after another failure. Callahan was almost constantly under the influence of prohibited substances. His mood swung from mind-blowing euphoria to wild, uncontrollable paranoia. When Amber finally realized that she had married a monster and tried to break the marriage bonds, it was already too late. He simply did not let her leave. Amber found herself in a real trap of cruel and abusive relationships, from which there seemed to be no way out. One day during an argument, Daniel, in a fit of rage, forcefully threw his wife onto a piece of concrete. She fell so unsuccessfully that she nearly injured her spine. Doctors later said that she miraculously remained unharmed. From the blow, strong swelling of the back muscles began, and for several days, Amber could not walk, writhing in pain and realizing that she was completely dependent on her tormentor. Another time, Callahan, under the influence of prohibited substances, attacked her from behind and cut off her oxygen. There was no rope. He simply squeezed her neck with his hands, watching her suffer. Amber had to pretend that she had lost consciousness. The woman went limp and stopped showing signs of life, only so that Daniel would get scared and finally loosen his fingers. But even that was not all. In the heat of arguments, when words ran out, the man repeatedly grabbed a kitchen knife. He pressed the cold blade to his wife's throat, enjoying her horror, and threatened to rip open her stomach if she tried to run away or call for help. Amber lived in constant fear, not knowing if she would wake up tomorrow, and prayed only for one thing: that he would simply fall asleep and that this night would not be her last. Several times Amber still tried to call the police, but Daniel would catch her, snatch the phone, and smash it to pieces. The woman also tried to obtain a court order of protection against her husband, but her petition was rejected for some reason. In the end, Amber escaped when Callahan was arrested again and this time sent to prison. While he was not at home, she packed her things and filed for divorce. After his release from prison in 2010, Daniel returned to what he started with: burglaries. His mental health deteriorated and he began to have hallucinations. Soon he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Because of his mental problems, the man often ended up in temporary holding centers, but his behavior was so terrible that his stay there did not last long. Daniel was very aggressive, constantly got into conflicts, and got into fights with the people around him. One day, he ran around someone else's property completely naked, with a crossbow stolen somewhere. He threatened everyone with reprisals and then set fire to the neighbor's barn. His behavior became more and more reckless and dangerous. And in 2014, Callahan was arrested for violating probation and sent back to prison. In the end, Daniel served 5 years of the 12-year suspended sentence, which was also an insufficient term for him to draw any conclusions. If the authorities had forced the man to spend all 12 years in prison, the victims in today's case would have had a chance to remain alive. Daniel's early release is just one of many mistakes of the system in today's case. Let's move to 2021, when Daniel had turned 30. Having been released from prison about 2 years earlier, still just as angry, with empty pockets and prison tattoos embedded under his skin, he found himself on the street. Callahan lived for a long time in a trailer in Brookhaven, Mississippi. But when he could not pay the rent and began threatening the landlord, he was kicked out and left without a roof over his head. By that time, Daniel had long since burned all bridges with his relatives. There was no one he could turn to for help. There was no family with whom he maintained contact. There were no friends, only accomplices and random acquaintances from shelters. He had nothing except an old worn jacket and, perhaps, a vague desire to survive. And it was then, out of desperation, that he decided to turn to his biological sister, a woman named Dixie. For the last 8 years, Daniel had not communicated with his sister, and there were good reasons for that. The last time Dixie had taken pity on her brother and let him stay with her, he repaid her with black ingratitude. He began to encourage her boyfriend to cheat, cynically inviting him to meet other women behind Dixie's back, not caring about his sister's feelings. It was after such betrayal that the woman threw her brother out the door, and since then they had hardly communicated. However, now Callahan decided to knock on his sister's door again, and it so happened that it was on Christmas. Perhaps the spirit of forgiveness and family unity was in the air. Or maybe Dixie simply remembered their shared nightmarish childhood and how they once held on to each other. Naturally, she felt sorry for her brother. By that time, there was no trace left of the resentment and anger. The woman sincerely wanted to believe that the years spent in prison and wandering the streets had taught Daniel something. She wanted to give him another chance to correct himself and become a human being. Learning that Daniel was sleeping wherever he could and had no place of his own, Dixie allowed him to live for free in an old trailer that stood on the back of her property. It was not a gift, but a probationary period. Dixie, remembering Callahan's character, set clear rules. She really did not want that unpleasant story with the boyfriend to repeat itself, or for her brother to bring his dubious acquaintances into her house. At Dixie's insistent demand, Daniel had to wake up at the crack of dawn every morning, get moving, and go look for work, any work, just so he could start supporting himself and not sit on her neck. Until he found a normal place and got back on his feet, Dixie promised to support him, giving him money for food and possibly driving him to interviews. She hoped that the strict regimen and her help would pull her brother out of the pit he had dug for himself. At first, everything went more or less well. Daniel dutifully got up early in the morning, went out to look for work, and sometimes came back with some news. Dixie began to hope that her faith in her brother had been justified, but soon the idol collapsed and the situation became extremely alarming. One night, when the moon was hiding behind the clouds, Daniel took a shovel. The man went into the forest, which was right behind the fence of Dixie's property, and began to dig furiously. He dug a huge hole there, deep as a grave. Returning before dawn, dirty and out of breath, he explained to Dixie without a shadow of embarrassment that this place was for her boyfriend, whom he planned to kill. The motive was simple and terrible: to take over his sister's house so there would be somewhere to live. In the following days, Daniel several times asked Dixie directly, "Can I bump off your guy?" At first, the woman did not take his words seriously. It seemed to her that her brother was grimly joking, trying to look tough after prison. But when the questions began to repeat every day with increasing persistence, the sister became seriously scared. She firmly explained to Daniel that she loved the father of her children and would not allow anyone, even her own brother, to interfere in the relationship and destroy her family. Callahan, noticing Dixie's fear, pretended that he had simply made an unsuccessful joke and immediately dropped the topic. But all the signs indicated that this man, thoroughly steeped in prison romanticism, thirsted for blood, and it did not matter whose. Things only got worse after that. One cold night, when the wind was blowing through the old trailer, Daniel asked his sister for permission to spend the night on the closed veranda of the house, adjacent to the kitchen. It had gotten sharply colder outside, and there was no heating in the trailer. Dixie, though with apprehension, agreed. After all, he was her brother. He should not freeze on the street. In the middle of the night, Dixie suddenly woke up from a heart-rending, soul-chilling cry. The sound was so terrible that goosebumps ran down her back. She could not understand where it was coming from until she remembered that Daniel was sleeping on the veranda. Carefully looking in there, she saw her brother. He was asleep, but his sleep was terrible. His body was twitching, his hands were clenched into fists, and tears were flowing down his face. He was crying in his sleep, bitterly, sobbing the way only small children or broken people cry. Dixie was seriously frightened and, overcoming her fear, decided to wake her brother. She grabbed a broom and quietly poked him in the back. Daniel jumped up as if scalded by the sudden touch, wildly looking around, which frightened his sister even more. Coming to his senses a little, he admitted that he had been tormented by nightmares ever since he had screwed up. The man sat on the floor of the veranda, clutching his head with his hands, and repeated like a broken record that he had ruined everything, that he had made a mistake, but he never said what exactly he had done. No matter how much Dixie asked about the reasons for such anxiety and fear, her brother grimly remained silent and refused to explain anything. Only later, when the woman, having lost hope for frankness, was already about to go back to the bedroom, Callahan unexpectedly stopped her. Looking somewhere into the corner with empty eyes, he quietly admitted that he had taken a person's life there, in Boga Chito. "I didn't think it would affect me like this," he whispered, and in his voice there was something between fear and bewilderment. Dixie froze in place, not knowing what to think, whether these were hallucinations caused by years of taking prohibited substances, or whether Daniel, her own brother, had really taken someone's life, and now the burden of the cruel crime was strangling him at night, tearing him out of sleep with this terrible childlike crying. She had no answer, but from that night on, a cold fear settled in her soul. A few days later, when they were sitting by the fire in the yard, a song called "Murder in My Thoughts" began to play. Daniel's eyes instantly glazed over. His gaze became empty, as if he had fallen into his terrible memories. And then her brother, looking through his sister, declared in an icy voice, "That's why John Estes got what he deserved." Hearing these words, Dixie went cold. Her heart began to pound furiously. Could it be that her brother had just named the name of a real victim? Not just some random person, but the very one whose death he recalled in his nightmares. Everything inside the woman tightened with horror. No longer able to stay near Daniel and fearing to betray her confusion, Dixie, under a made-up pretext, referred to a sudden stomach pain and feeling unwell. She got up and, trying not to run, walked to her house. Locking the door, Dixie rushed to her laptop. With trembling hands, she turned it on and, praying that it would turn out to be a mistake, typed the name John Estes into the search bar. The search results made her blood run cold. In one of the areas called Boguechero, the very one her brother had mentioned, 36-year-old Jonathan Paul Estes had disappeared under unclear circumstances. The man had vanished without a trace, and his case, judging by the scant notes in the local crime reports, had never been solved. This could not be a coincidence. The world is too small for such accidents. How could Daniel, who had spent the last few years serving time and wandering the streets, know that the missing man was no longer alive? There could be only one explanation, terrible and irrefutable. Her brother had really taken John Estes' life. Now she knew for sure. Her brother Daniel was a murderer. The realization of this fact lay like a heavy stone on her shoulders. But along with the horror came a grim determination. Dixie wanted to do the right thing as an honest citizen and not let the criminal go unpunished. Gathering all her willpower, she went to the police. In the police station, the young woman was met with a cold shower. No one took her words seriously. The duty officer, tired of the endless stream of people, looked at her with poorly concealed boredom. Moreover, Dixie was essentially accused of having an overactive imagination, with hints that she apparently had mental problems or had watched too many detective series. The investigator threw up his hands and said that they needed physical evidence. The murder weapon, fingerprints, and not vague suspicions from a nervous woman based on fragmentary phrases from her unreliable brother. Apparently, the police themselves did not realize that their job was precisely to check such signals and look for those very pieces of evidence, and not to brush them off at the doorstep. Dixie did not know what to do. Her brother had confessed to the crime, but the police did not believe her. She turned to various legal authorities and different sheriff's offices, but everywhere she heard the same thing. Evidence was needed. Her words simply meant nothing. The relationship between brother and sister became increasingly tense, but Daniel, as if not noticing the growing wall of alienation, continued to confide in her from time to time. One evening, sitting on the porch and sipping cheap beer, he confessed to Dixie with some frightening casualness that he had molested a minor. Daniel did not provide any details, neither the name nor the age, nor when it had happened. He simply dropped the phrase into the air as something not worthy of attention, and immediately changed the subject, leaving his sister in a state of shock and disgust. For Dixie, this was the last straw. The death of a stranger was monstrous, but somewhere far away. But here and now, it was about a living child, possibly someone from their own circle. The woman shook at the thought that her own brother, who was sleeping on her veranda and whom she was helping to get his life together, could have abused a teenager. Gathering the remnants of her resolve, she went to the sheriff's office again, this time with a statement about a crime against sexual integrity. At the station, they listened to her, but with the same skeptical expression, they formally accepted the statement. An investigation began, which, however, ended immediately. Without names, dates, or specific facts, the case reached a dead end almost right away. Dixie was called in a couple of times for clarification, but she could not provide anything except the phrase, "thrown by her brother." The detectives threw up their hands. No corpus delicti, no victim, no case. Soon the investigation was quietly closed for lack of evidence, writing everything off as another fantasy and ravings of an unreliable relative. Dixie was left alone with her knowledge that her brother was not just a murderer, but also a molester of minors, and that the system she had tried to make work had betrayed her again. Later, Callahan told his sister that he had always wanted to become like his father, but now he had decided to outdo his old man and become not just a criminal, but a serial maniac. He even claimed to be writing a book on the subject. Daniel assured her that he would succeed where his father had failed, and at the same time would be able to avoid punishment. All this was the final blow for Dixie. She was now sincerely afraid of her brother because of his terrible statements and wanted to protect her family. Since the authorities ignored her appeals, the woman did the only thing in her power. She threw Daniel out of her house and forbade him from appearing there. Dixie said that she never wanted to see him again. After that, Callahan found himself on the street again. The man began to wander through various psychiatric institutions, using them as temporary housing. Doctors tried to treat him for schizophrenia and hallucinations, transferring him to other rehabilitation centers, but judging by the subsequent events, they did not achieve great results in treating the difficult patient. By 2024, the situation had worsened, which led to the tragic events that will be discussed further. During this period, Daniel became close with a woman who played an important role in today's story. Her name was Victoria Cox. Victoria was born in 1991. She was a little over 30. She was the mother of 3 children aged 9, 8, and 6. Little is known about her past. For some time, Victoria worked as a nanny at home. How she met Daniel also remained a mystery. Whether they studied together at school, were childhood friends, or a short romance flared up between them. However, they had known each other for many, many years. The whole horror of the situation was that Daniel was planning to do something terrible, and Victoria was going to join him. There was another woman, Callie Jo Brunette, who was 35. According to her relatives, Callie was kind, sociable, and simple-hearted. She called herself a country girl. Callie was a loving daughter, sister, and aunt, but more than anything in the world, she adored her 2 daughters, 4-year-old Erin and 6-year-old Jaylee. The Brunette family was inseparable. There was a special bond between the sisters. The 2 girls, as if made from the same template, looked like 2 peas in a pod. The same light hair that their mom braided into pigtails. The same freckles on their turned-up noses. The same explosive characters. Little Erin, despite her young age, was a real tomboy, feisty and headstrong. She never followed others and always did things her own way, whether it was choosing a toy in the store or deciding when to go to bed. Erin could stand up to anyone who tried to bully her. The boys in the sandbox quickly learned that this girl would not cry and complain, but could boldly fight back both verbally and physically. Sometimes Erin was sharp and capricious, especially if something did not go the way she wanted, but the reason for this was touching. She simply desperately wanted to be like her older sister. She copied her gait, her way of speaking, and demanded the same clothes as Jaylee. It seemed to her that if she was as serious and adult as her sister, the world would treat her with the same respect. In these caprices, one could feel not naughtiness, but a naive desire to grow up, catch up, and surpass the one she looked up to. To some extent, Callie and her 2 daughters could be called a happy family. The idyll was marred only by the fact that Callie had a long-term relationship with Daniel Callahan that had lasted for 13 years. The couple met when both were just over 20. Their romance would fade and then flare up again with new force. In 2024, Callie and Daniel reunited, and the man settled in a tent on the Brunette family property. No details of their relationship at that moment were revealed. Callahan simply lived on the property until Callie demanded that he leave her territory. However, the man did not want to become homeless again, so he refused to move out and tried to negotiate. But Callie was adamant, which caused even greater rage in her boyfriend. By June 2024, the situation had reached its peak. On the night of June 11th to 12th, Daniel was in the mobile home in Louisiana where the Brunette family lived. There, he committed his terrible crime. He attacked Callie and inflicted 50 stab wounds on her. It was a long and brutal attack, full of hatred and malice. It was not a spontaneous act. Most likely, Callahan had thought everything through and chosen the victim in advance. Unfortunately, after the attack, 35-year-old Callie Jo Brunette died. But the story did not end there. After the woman's death, Daniel kidnapped her 2 daughters. He shoved them into Callie's car, got behind the wheel himself, and headed from Louisiana to his home state of Mississippi. On the way, Callahan stopped at a wooded area at Victoria Cox's house and, right from the doorstep, told her everything he had done. He had taken a woman's life and kidnapped her 2 daughters. He asked Victoria to shelter him, and she agreed. This decision turned out to be fatal. A mother who had 3 children of approximately the same age as the kidnapped girls voluntarily became an accomplice to the criminal. Fortunately, Victoria's own children were not living with her at that time. By then, Child Protective Services had taken them away. Considering that she had agreed to help Daniel, who had just committed a crime, it was a wise decision on the part of the Child Protection Service. And then the real horror began. Callahan brought Callie's daughters to Victoria's house and began to molest the older sister, Jaylee, committing abuse against her. When he got physically tired, he handed her over to the owner of the house, and the adult woman, a mother of 3 children, continued the abuse, while Daniel simply sat and enjoyed it. Poor Jaylee, who had become a witness to the murder of her own mother just a few hours earlier, now had to endure the outrages of 2 adults. But the worst was for Erin, who adored her older sister. She saw her suffering and could do nothing to help her. It is impossible to imagine what kind of horror was going on in her head. 12 hours had passed since Daniel took Callie Brunette's life. The next morning, the young woman's parents, worried that they could not reach their daughter, contacted Erin's father, one of the girls, and asked him to check if everything was all right with them. The man was on good terms with his ex-partner, so he immediately went to Callie's house. Parking his car in the driveway, he immediately suspected something was wrong. There was dead silence in the house, and then a terrible picture opened up before him. Callie was lying in a pool of blood in her own bedroom. Her body was mutilated by dozens of wounds. The girls were missing, and Erin's father immediately reported it to the police. At that very moment, an all-points bulletin was issued, and the authorities immediately began searching. Meanwhile, Daniel Callahan contacted his sister Dixie. He wrote her a message on social networks, informing her that he had an emergency. He urgently needed money to replace a flat tire. Dixie immediately understood that her brother was lying, since he had not had a car for a long time. She ignored the message. This hasty decision will haunt the woman for the rest of her life. Dixie still wonders whether, if she had answered her brother then, she could have prevented what happened next or not. In reality, Dixie is the least to blame for what happened, because she repeatedly tried to warn the authorities about Daniel and his criminal tendencies, but she was ignored every time. So let's return to Victoria's house, which in fact was not even her property, but belonged to a relative. Cox lived there while the real owner was away. After the horror she had experienced and the abuse against Jaylee, little Erin could not calm down in any way. She kept crying, screaming, and calling for her mom. Her behavior was driving Daniel crazy. He began to get nervous, and not knowing how to make Erin be quiet, grabbed her and pressed her to his chest so that she could not breathe. As a result, Erin died from lack of air. The monster hoped that silence would come in the house, but then Jaylee started crying. Her brain was simply unable to cope with the mass of shocks in such a short time. Daniel Callahan could think of nothing better than to throw both sisters into a dirty pit in the backyard. Jaylee was forced to remain alone with the dead body of her sister Erin. So that the captive could not get out of the pit, Callahan set up a barrier around the ditch using an animal cage. Fortunately, the authorities did not sit idle. After the disappearance of the 2 sisters in Louisiana, they quickly found out that their mother, Callie Brunette's car, had been stolen. Using surveillance cameras, the police tracked the car's route to the house where Victoria Cox lived, and where Daniel was at that moment with the 2 captives. Closer to evening, on June 12th, almost a day after the kidnapping, the police arrived at the house and found the 2 missing sisters in the pit in the backyard. 6-year-old Jaylee was still alive but in terrible condition. Her 4-year-old little sister, Erin, was lying next to her. The authorities did not manage to save her. Callahan and Victoria Cox were immediately taken into custody at the scene of the crime. When the policeman read Daniel his rights, he immediately waived them and made a full confession on camera. He said that he was completely sober and had not taken any prohibited substances except antidepressants prescribed by his doctor, and he had no excuses for what he had done. Later, Callahan told reporters that he was constantly being watched so that he would not commit suicide, but he would still find a way to do it. On camera, he admitted that he regretted it and, in order to speed up the judicial process, agreed not to contest the charges. In Daniel's opinion, a lethal injection was the simplest thing they could offer him. Victoria Cox also voluntarily gave testimony to law enforcement agencies, which fully coincided with everything Callahan had said. She confessed to the molestation and the horrifying details, recounting what Jaylee had to endure. Now that both suspects had confessed to what they had done, they were placed in custody pending trial. People did not understand how a person with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, suffering from hallucinations, could have been calmly released. At the trial, both criminals pleaded guilty. The hearings in their case took place quite recently, at the end of 2025. 38-year-old Daniel Callahan was sentenced to several life imprisonments, deprived of the right to parole. Callahan will not be able to leave this world by means of a lethal injection, but will have to answer for his crimes before other inmates as well. Unfortunately, for the murder of Jonathan Estes, in which Daniel confessed to his sister Dixie, he never faced any punishment. Victoria Cox was sentenced to 40 years in prison. When asked how a mother of 3 children became involved in terrible crimes against minors, the woman did not answer anything and lowered her eyes. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Do you like watching reality shows? Do you believe what they show you? Today, I will tell you the truth about one reality show. And believe me, this truth is very different from what they show you on the screens. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. On September 3rd, 1997, an unusual girl was born in the Japanese city of Yokohama. Her name was Hana Kimura. The girl's mother, Kyoko, was Japanese, and her father was from Indonesia. The mixed origin was reflected in the child's appearance. The baby strongly differed with facial features, atypical for other Japanese people. Hana was the only child in the family. She had neither brothers nor sisters. The parents adored their little miracle, but unfortunately, it did not last long. A few months after the girl's birth, disagreements began to arise between the spouses. One day, when Hana turned 1 year old, her father left the family forever. In Japan, family upbringing plays a key role. Both parents actively participate in this process. Both the mother and the father have a special role. For example, the mother instills household skills in the child, while the father can have a heart-to-heart talk with his son or daughter. After her husband left, Kyoko remained alone with the little child. She was worried that her daughter would now grow up in an incomplete family. The absence of male upbringing could negatively affect even a girl. That is why Kyoko decided to be strong, no matter what. The woman promised herself that she would raise her daughter on her own and become the best example for her. For the first time, little Hana faced problems when she went to school. The children immediately noticed that Kimura was not like the others. Her father's Indonesian roots played an important role in the girl's appearance. Classmates teased Hana, came up with offensive nicknames for her, just because she was only half Japanese. Hana took her schoolmates' mockery very hard, but looking at her mother, the girl strived to be as strong as she was. Kyoko always coped with difficulties and always taught her daughter this. After Hana's mother was left without a husband, she went into sports. By 2003, Kyoko was a wrestler and was professionally engaged in wrestling. The 5-year-old daughter watched as her mom won competitions time after time. The furious energy of the ring charged her with strength to fight difficulties in everyday life. However, besides victories, there were also defeats. Hana more than once saw how the audience booed her mom. She saw what injuries athletes received in fights, and she did not like it. Hana was familiar with wrestling from the inside. While other children played computer games, met with friends, and went to the movies, Kimura accompanied her mom to competitions in different parts of the country and even helped sell merchandise. Despite her closeness to professional sports, in childhood, Hana was more interested in dancing. She dreamed of becoming a singer or a model. But to become a star of this level, Talent, time, and money were required. Once in her teenage years, Hana attended a performance by the star of women's wrestling, Io Shirai. The audience was delighted with the complex techniques and signature moves of the famous athlete. After this show, Kimura made the final decision. She wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps. Hana began training with other young wrestlers. She did great. In 2016, at the age of 19, the girl debuted in professional wrestling. In the same year, she won the Japan Junior Championship. Hana was a born athlete and quickly gained recognition. It was felt that the wrestling spirit had been passed on to her from her mother. Soon, others noticed it too. The legendary Japanese wrestler and actor, working under the pseudonym Akira, took over Hana's training. Hana Kimura quickly won the love of the audience and became a star of the ring. On the main arenas of Japan, she put on a real show. The girl had watched since childhood what the audience reacted to during fights and skillfully used it. Tens of thousands of fans greeted the wrestler with enthusiastic shouts. She was predicted a successful future in sports. In addition to being a successful athlete, she stood out with her non-standard beauty for Japan. In 2017, Kyoko ended her career with a farewell show. She and Hana faced each other in the ring and clashed in a match. The mother did not spare her daughter and delivered hard blows, but in the end, Hana won. Kyoko very symbolically passed the palm of primacy to her grown-up daughter. When Hana turned 21, producers noticed her and offered her to take part in a reality show. In this reality, participants built love. Hana had never had a boyfriend. Her whole life passed in constant training, championships, and fights. Romance for her was usually in the background, but deep down, she always dreamed of meeting a worthy man. She wanted to feel weak next to a strong partner. The reality show was broadcast throughout the country, and even if Hana did not find the love of her life there, a wider audience would learn about her. This fame could advance her sports career. In general, the young wrestler took a risk and agreed to participate in the sensational project. In the reality show called Terrace House, 3 guys and 3 girls from different social strata aged 18 to 30 participated. They all lived in one house, communicated, and built relationships. Unlike other reality shows, the heroes still went to work, communicated with their friends outside the house, and in the evenings returned to Terrace House and told each other how their day went. The main idea of the project was to show viewers, using living examples, how relationships are built and attachment arises between 2 people. Most similar programs are based on conflicts between participants and scandalous intrigues. All this was arranged only to capture the viewer's attention. The Japanese version of Terrace House was more like real life. Instead of endless quarrels, fights, and broken dishes, the producers initially bet on restrained conversations, a warm atmosphere, and natural development of events. It was this approach that caused the audience's trust and the critics' admiration. According to publicly available information, the show's heroes could leave the shooting at any moment if something did not suit them. In 2019, Hana Kimura was invited to the 5th season of Terrace House. There were no scripts on how to behave. At least, that is what they told the viewers. After the deal with Netflix, Terrace House began to be broadcast not only in Japan. The reality show reached a new level. The whole world was now watching its heroes, and the whole world was supposed to see Hana. The girl was very worried, but at the same time, she was simply happy. She felt that she was on the threshold of a new chapter in her life. It was true. Only, unfortunately, Hana could not know that this chapter would be the final one for her. By the time she joined the reality show, Hana Kimura was no longer a novice in sports, but an experienced titled wrestler with a difficult fate. A girl with a strong character and unusual appearance. With great devotion to her work, which she had known since childhood, Hana had thousands of her own fans. In the first episodes, the young wrestler appeared as a sweet, sociable, very vulnerable girl. She often joked that at 22 years old, she still had not learned how to flirt with guys. She still did not have a boyfriend. Hana's sincerity pleased the viewers. They watched with interest how the girl behaved on dates and built romantic relationships. The first one who attracted Kimura's attention was the 26-year-old basketball player, Ryo Tawatari. At first, the young people spent a lot of time together, communicated, laughed, and cooked dinner. Something like friendship developed between them. However, for Hana, it was always something more. She sincerely got embarrassed and blushed when Ryo appeared on the horizon, but she did not know how to openly declare her feelings. In love affairs, Hana was completely inexperienced. While the athlete doubted herself, another girl appeared in the house, the 26-year-old Russian actress Vivi. Unlike the wrestler, Vivi perfectly knew how to behave with men. She instantly turned Ryo's head. In the end, the man succumbed to the charms and switched to the actress. The choice in favor of another girl painfully hurt Hana. Now, the guy she liked was building a relationship with another right before her eyes. Inexperienced in love affairs, Kimura tried to hide her resentment and disappointment, but emotions sometimes broke out at the most inappropriate moment. One day, Vivi and Ryo were openly flirting with each other in the kitchen. Hana was sitting at the table and saw everything. No matter how she restrained herself, it was painful for her to watch this. The girl pretended to be reading a book, but at that time, she was simply trying to hide her tears. Ryo liked Hana, but he preferred another, more experienced in love affairs, Vivi. The viewers sympathized with Kimura. Her experiences were clearly not feigned. Over time, Hana began to blame her sports career for everything. The thing is that men in Japan valued fragile, graceful women more. The professional wrestler looked too strong and independent. Hana spent all her free time on sports, and there was simply no place for romance. Now she looked unfeminine and, moreover, did not know how to flirt at all. Soon, 25-year-old Kai Kobayashi, a beginning stand-up comedian, appeared in Terrace House. It was he who comforted Hana after the breakup with Ryo, and she really liked Kai's care. Sympathy quickly arose between the guy and the girl. They even went on several dates, but quickly realized that nothing but friendship could be. In 2020, something happened that completely destroyed Kimura's image as a sincere, kind girl. Kai accidentally threw Hana's wrestling costume into the dryer along with his clothes. As a result, the thing was ruined, shrank, lost its appearance, and became unusable for further use. For Hana, it was not just a sports uniform. The costume was a symbol of her success and achievements. It was in it that the athlete entered the ring in front of 40,000 fans and won the match. And now this symbol was destroyed. Of course, it all happened unintentionally. Kai did not intend to ruin anything, but the thing was so dear to Hana that she could not restrain herself and said a bunch of offensive words to her friend. She called him an irresponsible person, an egoist, and a worthless comedian. Emotions were tearing the girl apart, and she wanted to hurt Kai more painfully. The guy silently listened to the familiar's claims and apologized again. But his calmness finally drove Hana out of herself. She stood up and left the kitchen where the scandal had flared up, but on the way, she tore the cap off Kai's head and threw it on the floor. This whole emotional scene was not typical for the Japanese Terrace House. The clash over the ruined costume left an unpleasant aftertaste for the viewers. Most fans of the reality show condemned Hana's ugly behavior. Usually, the heroes behaved decently and did not show excessive emotions on the screen. This is what the Terrace House show pleased the public with. It was wild to watch someone insult another person because of a ruined thing. And since then, Hana Kimura has turned into an object of hatred and ridicule for the viewers. The quarrel happened back in January, but this episode aired only at the very end of March 2020. By that time, Hana and Kai had already made up and were calmly living on. But for viewers of the reality show around the world, this scandal became a real sensation. Unlike other reality shows, Terrace House participants could follow the fans' reactions in real time. Their phones were not taken away. The participants calmly left the filming site. As soon as that very episode with the ruined wrestling costume aired, the public literally pounced on Hana. The crowd's reaction became a real nightmare for the girl. This episode so enraged the viewers that producers received letters demanding that Hana be excluded from the project. Her social media account was subjected to harassment by thousands of haters. It seemed to Hana that her entire sports career would now go to hell. People hated the wrestler for that thoughtless gesture towards Kai when she knocked the cap off his head. The comments on the internet sounded offensive. The haters attacked Kimura's unusual appearance. They reminded her of her origin. Once the girl had already experienced such a stage. Once classmates had also bullied her for her appearance. Now the haters wrote that she should get out of the project because such a girl was unworthy of love. The wave of negativity did not stop. Hana felt rejected not only by Japanese society, but also by viewers from all over the world. It got to the point that she was afraid to leave the house so as not to run into a crowd of ill-wishers. It seemed to the girl that there was simply no way out of this situation, and the attacks would not end. Over time, the scandal subsided. Every day, new events happened in the reality show. Interest in Hana's act gradually faded. The negative comments did not go anywhere, but there were much fewer of them. Hana's sports hardening helped her cope with all this. She was a fighter. To give up and withdraw into herself would mean to suffer defeat, the same as in the ring. Kimura clenched her teeth, shook herself off, and moved on. She simply had no other choice. The wrestler was used to going to victory through pain. In spite of everyone, she decided to stay in the project. In April 2020, a month after the ill-fated episode aired, filming of the reality show had to be suspended due to the pandemic. A quarantine was announced in Japan, and all Terrace House participants went home. While the whole world was in isolation, episodes of the show shot in advance were still airing. The viewers almost forgot about the scandal arranged by the wrestler. Despite the fact that the young people had long made up, Kai and Hana were friends again as before. One of the new episodes stirred up the old incident again. The thing is that the Terrace House reality show was often discussed live. Public figures gathered and expressed their opinion about the project. One of such commentators mentioned the legendary wrestling costume. He said that Kimura had been upset in vain because she had other, no less famous outfits. He had seen her in them in the ring, and in his opinion, the girl had gone too far. This short and accidentally thrown phrase was enough for a new wave of negativity to fall on Hana. Only now, everything was different. The girl was used to training a lot, meeting with friends, and always being in sight. But now, during the quarantine, she was locked in 4 walls and left to herself. There was no one around. There was not a soul who would calm her down and lend a shoulder. Every day, Hana woke up in loneliness. She opened the internet and read the same bilious messages addressed to her. She wanted to drop everything, run away, and hide. But it was forbidden to go outside without a reason. The world around her narrowed down to the size of the apartment. The athlete felt as if she had been driven into a trap from which there was no way out. Only she and only her ill-wishers who sent her curses in SMS in batches. Hana realized that her life had changed forever. It would no longer be possible to regain her former success with the viewers. In that difficult period of time, unable to bear the mental pain, she began to inflict injuries on herself. Hana seemed to be punishing her body for the crowd's hatred. The girl felt physical pain, which at least for a while overshadowed someone else's malice with itself. At first, Kimura did not remain silent. She tried to fight the general hatred. The girl begged people to stop the cruelty, wrote on social networks how painful it was for her, how unpleasant it was to read messages about herself and her appearance. However, these requests only fueled curiosity and generated new discussions. People openly wished the wrestler death, threatened with violence, and called her the last words. No matter how strong a person Hana Kimura was, she was just a girl who had no opportunity to protect herself. One against thousands. She let every message full of hatred pass through herself. Loneliness, isolation, and hundreds of offensive comments did their job. The athlete could not withstand the harassment. She broke down. On the night of May 23rd, 2020, 2 months after the episode, with the scandal over the ruined costume aired, Hana published photos of self-harm marks on social networks and wrote a post. She listed the humiliating comments that were sent to her in private messages. "Die, you are disgusting, get lost, no one needs you." Each message did not differ in flight of fancy. It was just that most of the viewers following the Terrace House participants considered it necessary to express their negativity to Hana. People were also sitting at home in quarantine, and, apparently, in insulting another person, they found entertainment for themselves. Kimura admitted how painful it was for her to read this. Hana was only 22 years old. Ahead of her was a whole life full of joyful events, successes, and hopes. But she no longer saw her future and did not find a way out of this nightmare. The last person Hana turned to was her mother. That evening, Hana was sitting in her apartment opposite the mirror. In the reflection, she did not see a successful athlete at all. The girl decided that she no longer had the strength to fight all this negativity and hatred. Hana wrote her mother a farewell message, said how much she loved her, and thanked her for everything. Early in the morning of May 23rd, after Hana Kimura published her last post, she was found dead in her apartment in Tokyo. The 22-year-old Hana Kimura, a rising star of professional wrestling, was lying on the bed with a plastic bag on her head. Next to her was a cylinder with toxic gas. She suffocated. On the bedroom door, the girl hung a note with a warning that there was poisonous gas inside. She took care of those who would find her. Hana did not want anyone to accidentally get hurt. The news of her death spread very quickly on the network. All the offensive comments on various platforms and messages with threats suddenly began to disappear. People who in recent months had turned Hana's life into a real hell did not want to bear responsibility. They successfully deleted the digital traces of their crime against the person. The haters perfectly understood what they had done. The goal of any harassment is to cause pain, and they achieved their goal. Soon after Hana Kimura's death, the producers announced that the release of new episodes of Terrace House was suspended. Plans for further filming after the end of the quarantine also remained in question. In August 2020, all episodes where Kimura was present were completely removed from the air. Only fragmentary video recordings remained, and this was only the beginning of dubious measures related to the filming of Terrace House. In Hana's voluntary departure, many blamed the network users who had arranged the harassment. But the most terrible thing was something else. Fan hatred was not the main reason for what happened. The situation began to clear up when the girl's mother, Kyoko, gave an interview. The upset woman blamed the producers of the reality show for everything. The article was titled, "Terrace House Took the Life of My Daughter." So, on March 31st, 2020, an episode aired in which Hana staged a scandal over the ruined costume and attacked Kai. After that, the whole world went into quarantine. The public did not receive new reasons for discussion and continued to torment Kimura with their nitpicking and insults. Hana was forced to experience all this alone, locked in the four walls of her apartment. On May 15th, it was Hana's grandmother's birthday. For the first time in a long time, Hana found herself in the circle of her loved ones. All evening she held on, but then she gave vent to her emotions and burst into tears. She confessed to her mother that in fact, in the reality show, she had been forced to portray a scandal maker. The girl herself did not want this. When a new wave of hate flared up on social networks, Hana Kimura constantly wrote to the show's producers. She directly stated that she was on the verge of death. However, no one took her words seriously. Late at night, on May 23rd, Hana published a frightening photo with traces of cuts on her arms. One of her close friends was in another country at that time. Due to the time difference, she read the post earlier than others and raised the alarm. The friend contacted Kyoko, Hana's mother. The woman, accompanied by another friend, hurried to her daughter's apartment, but it was already too late. In the interview, Kyoko Kimura told about the pressure her daughter faced on the reality show. It turned out that the producers had forced Hana to stage that very scandal. They forced her to hit Kai in the face. It was this scene that would cause a flurry of emotions among the viewers. The ratings of Terrace House would rise to unprecedented heights. At the producer's request, the girl flatly refused to hit her friend. She was a successful wrestler. To arrange a domestic fight for the program's ratings was unprofessional for her. The most she could allow herself was to knock the cap off the young man's head. But, as it turned out, even this was enough to become an enemy for the project's fans. It turned out that refusing to follow the scriptwriter's instructions could easily lead to fines of tens of thousands of dollars. Although the heroes were paid only $1,000 for participating in the show, it also turned out that the participants could not leave Terrace House of their own free will, as had been stated earlier. There was a ban on romances on the side and communication with reporters. All these points were spelled out in the contract, But for the viewers, everything was presented differently. Kyoko Kimura's words were confirmed by Kai Kobayashi, with whom Hana had the quarrel. He said that as soon as the cameras were turned off, the girl apologized to him and said that it was a script. Later, Kai told an even wilder story about the producer's idea. On one of the dates in the trampoline center, the guy was supposed to grab Hana by the chest, but he refused to do it. The girl was already worried about her image. The reality was broadcast all over the world, and such an insult would put her in a stupid situation. After this incident, Kai no longer wanted to cooperate with the film crew and simply waited for the end of the contract. Therefore, when Kimura staged a scandal over the wrestling costume, Kai did not add fuel to the fire. He calmly listened to the claims and asked for forgiveness. Such instructions came from the producers every day. After Kimura's death, many participants ignored the bans and gave interviews to the press. In fact, the Terrace House show was no different from most realities. The program's management demanded that participants perform actions that would cause a reaction from the viewers. Of course, the public did not know all this. People were used to seeing in Terrace House a calm home environment, unhurried development of romantic relationships, and respectful communication between participants. Hana's aggressive behavior caused a wave of anger, although Kimura acted only on the instructions of the producers. Neither friends nor relatives could protect Hana from anonymous hatred on the network. Even if she violated the contract terms and exposed the show, no one would believe her. In addition, the management would fine her a large sum. The producers knew that Hana's emotional state was deteriorating every day. They advised her to delete her social media accounts and not read the comments. But Kimura could not do that. She was a public figure in wrestling and the leader of her team. Hana was engaged in promoting this sport and dreamed of attracting new people to women's wrestling. And in response, she received only cruelty and indifference. When Hana passed away, her mother did not remain silent. She collected all the screenshots of comments and messages attacking her daughter and took them to the police. The authorities tracked the owners of the accounts from which the harassment was carried out. However, many haters got away with it. During the investigation, it turned out that one of the network users had created more than 100 personal pages just to poison Hana's life. He was fined only $70, and 2 other persecutors were ordered to pay Kyoko Kimura $1,000 each. That is how stupidly and absurdly the life of a young athlete from Japan ended. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. The January air in Paris, California, felt like a blade against the skin of a girl who appeared to be 10, though she was actually 17. She stood shivering under a street lamp, clutching a deactivated cell phone found in a pile of household filth. When the dispatcher answered, she explained that she had just crawled through a window to flee a nightmare. Behind the unremarkable facade of her home, 12 siblings remained shackled to beds with heavy padlocks. This was the moment the world first heard the name Turpin, a family that used the shield of suburban normalcy to hide a literal house of horrors. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the rot that eventually consumed the house on Muirwood Road, one has to travel back to the late 1950s and early 60s, to the jagged hills of West Virginia. David Cyrus Turpin was born into a world defined by traditional values and a quiet, almost sterile brand of middle-class stability. His father, James, was a man who prized order and religious devotion. David was the kind of child who went unnoticed, the quiet boy in the corner who excelled at math but struggled to meet the eyes of his peers. He was a creature of precision, a trait that would later lead him into the world of high-stakes aerospace engineering. But it was a precision that masked a deep, growing need for absolute control over his environment. By the early 1980s, David had moved to Virginia, his life revolving around his studies and the strict tenets of his faith. It was during a church service that he first saw Louise Robinette. She was barely out of childhood, just 16 years old, with a background that was far more fractured than his own. Louise had grown up in a home where boundaries were often blurred and instability was the only constant. She was looking for a savior, someone to provide the rigid structure she lacked. David, 7 years her senior, looked like that savior. Their courtship was not a romance of shared dreams, but one of shared isolation. David began to alienate Louise from her family almost immediately, convinced that the outside world was a corrupting influence designed to tear them apart. In 1984, the tension reached a breaking point. When Louise's family attempted to intervene, the couple did the unthinkable. They eloped. They fled across state lines, sparking a desperate police chase that ended with a confrontation between David and Louise's father. But the law, at the time, saw a young woman who claimed to be in love, and the couple was allowed to vanish into the vastness of the American South. They settled in Fort Worth, Texas. For a time, they were the picture of the American dream, albeit a blurry one. David landed a prestigious position as an engineer for Lockheed Martin, and later, Northrop Grumman. He was the kind of employee companies cherished, quiet, reliable, and possessed of a high-security clearance that suggested a man of unimpeachable character. He spent his days designing complex systems for fighter jets and surveillance technology, while his nights were spent designing a far more sinister system at home. Louise, meanwhile, was falling deeper into a specific, radicalized interpretation of Pentecostalism. She believed that her purpose on earth was a biological on, to birth as many children as God would allow. To Louise, every pregnancy was a victory in a spiritual war. Every child was a soldier for a kingdom that only she and David truly understood. This wasn't just a large family. It was the beginning of a cult of two, where David was the undisputed patriarch and Louise was his high priestess. As the children began to arrive, one after another, year after year, the walls of their world began to thicken. In Texas, the neighbors started to notice a pattern that didn't fit the suburban mold. The Turpin children were rarely seen during the daylight hours. When they were spotted, they appeared like ghosts, waif-like figures with pale skin and hollow eyes, dressed in matching, outdated outfits that looked like they belonged in a previous century. David and Louise were masters of the veneer. They would occasionally take the children to Disney World, dressing them in bright, identical shirts and lining them up for photographs. To a casual observer, it looked like a quirky, perhaps overly disciplined family. But if you looked at the children's faces in those photos, the smiles never reached their eyes. By the late 90s, the family began to spiral financially, despite David's six-figure salary. The cost of maintaining 13 people and the couple's burgeoning shopping addiction was overwhelming. They filed for bankruptcy in 2011, but even then, the system failed to see the red flags. The bankruptcy court saw a family struggling with debt, not a family where the children were being systematically starved. David realized that to keep his secret, he needed a shield. He registered his home as a private school, the Sandcastle Day School. This legal loophole allowed him to bypass state oversight. There were no teachers, no curriculum, and no outside eyes. The children were no longer students of the state. They were subjects of the Turpin regime. The move from Texas to California was not just a change of scenery, it was a strategic retreat. They were moving to a place where they could be close but invisible. In the sprawling suburbs of Riverside County, they found the perfect hiding place, a brand new cul-de-sac where neighbors were too busy with their own lives to wonder why the lights at 112 Muirwood Road only turned on when the rest of the world was going to sleep. David and Louise were no longer just parents. They were the architects of a prison, and their children were the only inmates. The transition from the dusty suburbs of Texas to the sun-drenched hills of California wasn't a move toward a brighter future. It was a strategic deepening of the shadows. By 2010, the Turpins had abandoned their home in Rio Vista, leaving behind a trail of filth and unpaid debts that would have signaled a crisis to anyone who cared to look. But in the vast, impersonal landscape of the American West, it is frighteningly easy for a family of 15 to simply evaporate. They first landed in Murrieta, a town known for its quiet streets and family-friendly atmosphere. It was here that David Turpin perfected the legal armor that would protect his kingdom for nearly a decade. California, for all its progressive reputation, possessed a glaring vulnerability in its education code. A parent could simply file a private school affidavit, a single sheet of paper that transformed a residential home into an autonomous educational institution. There were no requirements for background checks, no mandatory inspections, and no state-mandated testing. David christened his nightmare the Sandcastle Day School. On paper, he was the principal. His children were the students. In reality, the school was a black hole where time, education, and basic human rights went to die. The state saw a functioning private academy. The neighbors saw nothing at all. It was during this period that the vampire schedule became a mandatory law within the household. David and Louise realized that the greatest threat to their control was the sun. Sunlight brought out neighbors. It brought out mail carriers and delivery drivers. And it made the skeletal frames of their children too visible to ignore. The solution was as simple as it was cruel. The family would sleep during the day behind heavy, light-blocking curtains, and live during the night. Inside the house, the atmosphere was one of stifling, stagnant silence. The children were forbidden from talking to one another unless it was necessary. They were forbidden from playing. The only sound that filled the halls at 3 a.m. was the shuffling of feet as the siblings moved in synchronized patterns, a marching exercise David enforced to ensure they stayed active enough to survive, but not healthy enough to resist. The social echo in Murrieta was one of profound unease. Neighbors would later recount seeing the children through the flickering blue light of a television screen at midnight. A row of pale, unmoving faces staring at a screen that was often the only window they had to the world they weren't allowed to inhabit. One neighbor remembered seeing a few of the children late at night, digging through the trash for food. When she tried to speak to them, they didn't run. They simply froze, as if they lacked the basic social software to process a stranger's voice. By the time the family moved to the final house in Paris, 112 Muirwood Road, the isolation was absolute. The extended family back in West Virginia and Virginia had been systematically ghosted. Louise's sister would later explain that she hadn't spoken to Louise in years. Every attempt at contact was met with a wall of silence or a vague excuse from David. The grandparents, who had once been sent photos of the children in matching outfits, were now completely barred from the family's life. David told his children that their relatives were evil, that the world outside their front door was a den of pedophiles and kidnappers, and that only he and Louise could keep them safe. The financial paradox of the Turpin family is perhaps the most difficult aspect to reconcile. David was earning a six-figure salary as a high-level engineer, yet the family filed for bankruptcy twice. The money didn't go toward high-quality groceries or medical care for the children. Instead, it was funneled into a bizarre, obsessive-compulsive cycle of consumerism. David and Louise were addicted to the high of buying things. They filled the garage with expensive toys, strollers, and electronics, most of which remained in their original packaging, while the children slept on the floor. To maintain the veneer of a super family, they occasionally ventured out for elaborate public displays. The most jarring were the trips to Las Vegas for David and Louise's wedding vow renewals. They visited a chapel multiple times to be married by an Elvis impersonator. In the videos from these events, the children are lined up in identical outfits, the girls in purple dresses with white tights, the boys in matching suits. They look like props in a theatrical production. The Elvis impersonator later noted that the children were remarkably well-behaved, a chilling euphemism for the catatonic state of fear they were actually in. Psychologically, the power dynamic was a closed loop. David was the principal, the ultimate authority, who held the keys to the padlocks. Louise was the enforcer, the one who monitored the cameras she had installed throughout the house, the one who would strike the children for stealing a piece of bread or for washing their hands above the wrist. They created a world where the only way to survive was to become invisible. But as the years passed and the children grew into adults who still possessed the bodies of children, the walls of the Sandcastle Day School began to crumble from the inside. The children were getting older, and they were starting to realize that the safety their parents promised was actually a slow, methodical execution. The air inside 112 Muirwood Road didn't circulate, it stagnated. thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, rotting waste, and a peculiar metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. To the outside world, the house was a silent beige box in a row of identical boxes. But once the front door clicked shut, the suburban reality evaporated, replaced by a kingdom of filth where the laws of the modern world ceased to exist. David and Louise Turpin didn't just neglect their children, they curated an environment of systematic sensory deprivation. The house was perpetually dark, the heavy curtains never parted, creating a twilight world where the passage of time was measured not by the sun, but by the shifting shadows in the hallway. The vampire schedule was more than a logistical choice. It was a psychological anchor. By forcing the children to remain awake through the night and sleep through the day, the parents ensured that their students were perpetually disoriented, living in a state of chronic jet lag that made resistance almost physically impossible. The physical reality of their confinement was anchored in cold steel. What began years earlier as simple ropes had evolved into something far more industrial. David had purchased heavy-duty chains and padlocks from local hardware stores, the kind designed to secure gates or heavy machinery. These were used to tether the children to their bunk beds, sometimes for weeks at a time. The sound of the metal clinking against the bed frames became the ambient soundtrack of the house. It was a sound that meant total immobilization. The siblings were often chained in a way that prevented them from reaching the bathroom, forcing them to remain in their own waste for days, a humiliation intended to strip away the last vestiges of human dignity. In the rare moments they were unchained, the rules of the house remained just as restrictive. Hygiene was treated as a luxury that was almost never granted. The children were permitted to bathe exactly once a year. If they were caught washing their hands above the wrist, it was seen as a defiance of David's authority, a sin that resulted in punishment. This usually involved being choked, struck, or having their hair pulled until clumps were left in their parents' hands. Because they were never allowed to see a doctor or a dentist, their bodies began to fail in silence. Their teeth rotted in their gums. Their skin took on a translucent, waxen quality from a total lack of vitamin D. But perhaps the most calculated cruelty was the food game. David and Louise were not just starving their children, they were taunting them with the concept of abundance. David would frequently return from the grocery store with boxes of frozen pizzas, trays of freshly baked apple pies, or colorful boxes of donuts. He would place these items on the kitchen counter, well within sight of the skeletal children, and forbid them from touching a single crumb. The siblings would be forced to watch as the food slowly molded and rotted in front of them. Meanwhile, their own meals consisted of a single frozen burrito or a peanut butter sandwich, often shared between multiple people once a day. The psychological depth of this torture cannot be overstated. By surrounding the children with food they couldn't eat and toys they couldn't touch, many of the Sandcastle Day school supplies remained in their original plastic wrap for a decade. David and Louise created a world of perpetual almost. It was a constant reminder that comfort existed, but it was not for them. The older siblings, some in their late 20s, were trapped in the bodies of prepubescent children. A 29-year-old sister weighed just 82 pounds. Her growth so severely stunted by malnutrition that her internal organs were beginning to mirror those of a woman twice her age. When they weren't chained, the children were often forced to perform schoolwork. This wasn't education, it was a repetitive, hollow ritual. They were given journals and told to write, over and over again. They wrote about their love for their parents, about their gratitude for the protection David provided, and thousands of pages of desperate, rambling prayers. It was a form of forced ideological alignment. If the principal checked a journal and found a lack of devotion, the chains would return. In the quiet hours of 4 a.m., while the rest of Paris dreamt of normal lives, the Turpin siblings were often forced to march. They would walk in circles through the cramped, cluttered rooms, weaving around piles of trash and unopened consumer goods, as Louise watched them through a network of cameras she had installed throughout the house. She monitored them from her bed, her eyes fixed on the flickering monitors. As she ate snacks the children were forbidden to touch. This was the why and the how of the Turpin regime. It was a closed ecosystem of control where every basic human need, food, light, movement, hygiene, was transformed into a weapon. The children weren't just prisoners, they were being unmade. They were being reduced to shadows that moved in the dark, waiting for a permission that almost never came. By the time 2018 arrived, the siblings weren't just looking for an exit. They were looking for a reason to believe that a world outside the beige walls even existed. The decision to break the perimeter of the Sandcastle Day School didn't happen in a single, impulsive heartbeat. It was a slow-motion rebellion that had been gestating in the mind of 17-year-old Jordan Turpin for nearly 2 years. The catalyst was a digital window she had managed to open in the dark. Jordan had discovered a discarded, deactivated smartphone in a pile of household refuse, a piece of plastic and glass that David and Louise likely considered a paperweight. But to Jordan, it was a lifeline. She had spent months secretly using the house's unsecured Wi-Fi to watch YouTube videos, soaking in the sights of a world where teenagers wore makeup, chose their own clothes, and lived without the constant clink of metal against a bed frame. By January 2018, the internal pressure within 112 Muirwood Road had reached a terminal velocity. David and Louise were talking about moving the family again, this time to Oklahoma. To Jordan and her older siblings, Oklahoma wasn't just a different state, it was a final, inescapable grave. They knew that if they were uprooted once more, the small amount of local awareness they had managed to attract would be reset to zero. The violence was also escalating. Louise had recently discovered that Jordan was watching videos. The subsequent punishment had been so severe, involving choking and threats of a permanent return to the chains, that Jordan realized she would either die in that house or die trying to leave it. The plan was a desperate two-person operation. Jordan and one of her sisters had spent nights whispering in the shadows, measuring the distance from their bedroom window to the ground. They had managed to hide a few basic items of clothing and the deactivated phone. On the morning of January 14th, 2018, while the vampire schedule had the rest of the house in a deep, malnourished slumber, the two sisters approached the window. The physical act of the escape was a testament to the frailty of their bodies. Jordan, though nearly an adult, possessed the bone density and muscle mass of a small child. Every movement was an agonizing effort. They managed to push the screen out, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stagnant silence of the cul-de-sac. But as they looked down at the pavement, the literal threshold of the world they had been told was a den of monsters, the sisters' resolve shattered. Overwhelmed by a decade of psychological conditioning, she turned back, choosing the familiar chains over the terrifying unknown. Jordan was alone. She dropped from the window, her thin legs absorbing a shock they were never meant to handle, and she began to move. She didn't run. She didn't have the strength for it. She walked, a frantic, stumbling gait that carried her away from the beige walls of her prison. She reached the edge of the neighborhood, her eyes darting toward every shadow. The streetlights felt like spotlights. She was wearing a pair of old, dirty sneakers and a thin hoodie, wholly inadequate for the 40-degree morning air. When she was far enough away that the house was no longer visible, she pulled out the phone. She knew that even a deactivated device could dial 911. Her hands were shaking so violently, she nearly dropped the plastic casing as she pressed the buttons. When the dispatcher answered, the voice on the other end was met with a sound that defied categorization. Jordan didn't sound like a 17-year-old girl. She sounded like a creature from another era. Her speech patterns stunted, her vocabulary limited to the school journals she had been forced to write for years. She told the dispatcher that she had just run away from home, that she lived in a house with 12 brothers and sisters who were being treated like animals. She explained that some of them were currently chained to their beds. When the dispatcher asked for her address, Jordan went silent. She didn't know it. She had lived in Paris for years, but she had never been allowed to see the numbers on the front of the house. She described the sandcastle sign David had printed. She described the neighborhood, but her sense of geography was a vacuum. For 20 minutes, Jordan remained on the line, shivering in the pre-dawn light, until a Riverside County Sheriff's Department patrol car slowed to a crawl beside her. When the deputy stepped out, he didn't see a teenager. He saw a small, waif-like figure who appeared to be perhaps 10 or 11 years old. Her skin was a translucent gray. Her hair was matted and thin, and she smelled of the stagnant air of the Muirwood residence. Jordan didn't just have her voice as evidence, she had the phone. She showed the deputy photos she had secretly taken inside the house. The images were a descent into madness. Pictures of her siblings' bruised wrists, shots of the heavy chains and rusted padlocks, and photos of the filth that covered every square inch of the interior. The deputy would later state that the reality of the images was so jarring, it felt like a hallucination. Jordan pleaded with him to go back, to save the others before David and Louise realized she was gone. She was terrified that the principal would find her and bring her back to the darkness. As the sun began to rise over Paris, the silence of the cul-de-sac was about to be shattered by the arrival of a small army. Jordan Turpin had done what 10 years of state oversight and neighborly suspicion had failed to do. She had pierced the veil of the Sandcastle Day School, and for the first time in their lives, her siblings were about to see a different kind of light. When the fleet of patrol cars pulled onto the curb of Muirwood Road, the neighborhood was still tucked under the blanket of a Monday morning, the rhythmic ticking of lawn sprinklers the only sound in the air. The deputies moved with a practiced, heavy silence toward the front door of number 112. They expected a confrontation, perhaps a barricade or a desperate father with a weapon, but what they found was a vacuum of emotion. Louise Turpin opened the door, her expression not one of guilt or terror, but of mild, confused annoyance. She looked like a woman interrupted during a nap, seemingly incapable of grasping that the perimeter of her kingdom had been breached. The officers stepped across the threshold, and the first thing that hit them wasn't a sight, but a wall of scent, a thick, cloying miasma of human filth, stale sweat, and the sharp, acidic tang of untreated waste. It was the smell of a prison or a tomb, disguised by the floral wallpaper of a suburban home. The interior was a labyrinth of consumerist debris, mountains of unopened boxes, piles of discarded clothing, and trash that reached the waist in some rooms. The flickering blue light of television screens cast long, distorted shadows across the hallway, the only illumination in a house that had long ago declared war on the sun. As they pushed deeper into the Sandcastle Day School, the deputies encountered the students. In the dim light, they saw figures that moved with a terrifying, ghost-like fragility. They found children huddled under thin blankets, their skin so pale it appeared almost blue, their eyes wide with a combination of fear and a total lack of comprehension. Then, they entered the bedrooms. The clink of metal against metal echoed through the halls as deputies discovered two of the siblings still shackled to their beds with heavy industrial chains and padlocks. The children didn't scream for help. They didn't even move. They simply stared, their bodies having long ago surrendered to the reality of the steel. David Turpin was found in a separate room. He was calm, almost helpful. He spoke in a soft, monotone voice, the voice of a principal explaining a difficult administrative decision. He told the investigators that he was protecting his children, that the world was too dangerous, and that his methods were necessary for their salvation. He showed no remorse, no realization that the skeletal figures being led out of his house were his own flesh and blood. To David, this wasn't a crime scene. It was a school inspection that had gone off the rails. The medical discovery that followed at the local hospitals would send shockwaves through the global community. As doctors began the intake process, the numbers began to tell a story that the human mind struggled to process. They saw a woman they assumed was a young teenager, only to discover she was 29 years old and weighed barely 82 pounds. They saw a boy they thought was 6, who was actually in his mid-teens. The malnutrition was so profound that several of the siblings suffered from severe cognitive impairment and physical stunting. Their growth plates had fused prematurely. Their internal organs were showing signs of early onset failure, usually seen in the elderly. The investigators spent the next several days combing through the digital and physical archives of the Turpin lives. They found thousands of pages of journals, the homework of the Sandcastle students. The entries were a descent into a shared madness, endless repetitions of praise for David, rambling, incoherent prayers, and desperate pleas for food. There were no records of doctor visits, no dental charts, nothing to indicate that these 13 humans had existed in any official capacity for nearly a decade. The investigation revealed that David and Louise had used the money from David's six-figure salary to fund their own lifestyle. Trips to Las Vegas, expensive clothing, and a hoarding habit, while their children were literally being consumed by hunger. The social echo in Paris was one of collective, paralyzing guilt. Neighbors who had lived 20 feet away for years gathered at the yellow police tape, their faces etched with the realization that they had heard nothing, or perhaps that they had heard something and convinced themselves it was a trick of the wind. They spoke of the matching outfits they had seen in the middle of the night, the pale children they had seen digging through trash, and the realization that the strange family at the end of the block had been a slow-motion catastrophe occurring in plain sight. In the interrogation rooms, the investigators tried to find the why. They looked for signs of a wider cult, for a charismatic leader who had led the Turpins astray, but they found only a two-person circle of sadism. David and Louise were their own prophets. They had created a faith based on absolute dominion, a religion where the only sacrament was control. They had convinced themselves that by unmaking their children, they were saving them. As the investigation closed and the trial loomed, the world was left to wonder how a house of horrors could remain so invisible, and how 13 siblings had managed to keep the flame of their humanity alive in a darkness that should have extinguished it years ago. In February 2019, David and Louise Turpin stood in a Riverside County courtroom, facing the wreckage of their own design. They pleaded guilty to 14 felony counts, including torture and false imprisonment, avoiding a trial that would have forced their children to recount every minute of their decade-long nightmare. During the sentencing, the air grew heavy as several of the Turpin siblings stepped forward to deliver victim impact statements. They spoke of the stolen years, the hunger, and the suffocating darkness of the Muirwood residence. One daughter told the court that while life had been a struggle, she was now a fighter, strong and moving forward. Yet the psychological complexity of the case was laid bare when another sibling expressed a lingering, gut-wrenching love for their parents, stating they had forgiven them because God loves everyone. David and Louise were both sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, a resolution that finally closed the door on the Sandcastle Day School. Today, the house on Muirwood Road is just another property in a quiet cul-de-sac. The chains are gone, the heavy curtains replaced with glass that finally lets in the light. For the 13 siblings, the journey from the Sandcastle Day School is a slow daily reclamation of their own lives. They are learning to navigate a world that was once a forbidden fairy tale, finding the courage to walk, to eat, and to simply exist. Their story remains a stark reminder. The most terrifying monsters don't live in the shadows. They live right next door, hidden behind a beige facade and a polite, neighborly wave. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. In June 2024, a man stood in a Florida courtroom with a permanent, tattooed grin carved into his skin, facing the ultimate price for a week of pure carnage. He shares a name with one of the world's most famous anti-heroes, but Wade Wilson is no fictional protagonist. Behind the ink of swastikas and the stitches across his mouth lies a human void that swallowed the lives of two innocent women in 2019. This is the reality of a monster who didn't just kill, he erased humanity with a smile. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. To understand the man who would eventually be known by the moniker of a comic book mercenary, we have to go back to the quiet, humid stretches of Tallahassee, Florida. The story of Wade Stephen Wilson doesn't begin with violence, but with a search for belonging. A search that was supposed to end when he was just an infant. Born in May 1994, Wade was adopted into the Testaseca family, a household that provided the kind of stability and middle-class comfort that many would consider a blueprint for a successful life. His adoptive parents, Stephen and Mary Testaseca, opened their home and their hearts to a boy they hoped would grow into a man of character. But as the years unfolded under the blistering Florida sun, it became clear that something within Wade was fundamentally out of alignment. In his early years, long before the ink began to swallow his features, Wade was, to the casual observer, a relatively ordinary child. However, those closest to him began to notice the subtle fracturing of his personality. His father would later describe a son who seemed to exist behind a glass wall, present in body, but emotionally unreachable. There were the typical childhood outbursts, but they were tinged with a level of intensity that suggested a deeper, more turbulent internal weather. By the time he reached his teenage years, the cracks in the foundation were no longer subtle, they were structural. The transition from a troubled boy to a career criminal happened with a jarring, rhythmic regularity. His school years were defined more by his absences and altercations than by his academic achievements. He eventually walked away from the traditional path of education, choosing instead a life dictated by the immediate gratification of the streets. His early 20s were a revolving door of county jails and short-lived freedom, a cycle of burglary, grand theft, and battery that hinted at a growing comfort with physical confrontation. But it was his physical transformation that served as the most visceral evidence of his psychological departure from society. It began slowly, a few pieces of ink on his arms, common enough in the humid gyms where he spent his time sculpting a massive, imposing physique. But the tattoos soon migrated, moving upward toward his neck, and eventually claiming his face as a canvas for a very specific kind of darkness. He didn't just get tattoos, he underwent a metamorphosis. He carved a stitched smile across his cheeks, an homage to the chaos of the Joker that signaled a permanent break from the Wade the Testacecas had tried to raise. Swastikas and pagan symbols began to populate his skin. Marks he would later claim were chosen simply because they were scary, a deliberate attempt to project a monster before he had even fully become one. The man who walked into the fall of 2019 was a walking paradox, a bodybuilder with the strength of an elite athlete and a face that looked like a nightmare brought to life. He had spent years drifting, moving between Tallahassee and the coastal cities of Florida, leaving a trail of broken relationships and concerned family members in his wake. His adoptive father, Stephen, watched from a distance as his son's identity was replaced by this ink-covered shell. He noted that Wade had become a master of manipulation, capable of turning on a superficial charm that belied the hollow space where his empathy should have been. By the age of 25, Wade Wilson had become a ghost in his own life. He had no permanent address, no steady career, and no allegiance to anyone but his own impulses. He was a man who felt nothing, and in that void, a dangerous pressure was building. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a predator who had spent a lifetime practicing the art of taking what he wanted. As October 2019 approached, the temperature in southwest Florida remained high, but a cold, calculated darkness was about to descend on the city of Cape Coral. The boy who was given every chance to thrive had finally decided to embrace the role he had been tattooing onto his skin for years. He was no longer just Wade. He was a storm waiting for a reason to break, and that reason was waiting in a bar on a Friday night. The psychological profile of Wilson during this period is a study in clinical detachment. Medical experts would later debate the presence of bipolar disorder and the long-term effects of potential brain injuries. But to those who encountered him in the wild, he was simply a force of nature that lacked a moral compass. He moved through the world with the confidence of a man who knew he could overpower almost anyone, and the face of a man who didn't care who saw him do it. This was the biography of a man who had spent 25 years erasing himself, only to fill the empty space with something far more terrifying. The venue for this fateful collision of lives was Buddha Live, a local bar on McGregor Boulevard that served as a sanctuary for the neighborhood. Inside, the bass of the music thrummed against the sternum, a physical reminder of the night's momentum. The floor was worn smooth by decades of dancers, and the air carried the heavy, sweet scent of humidity mixed with the sharp, clinical tang of sanitizer. Christine was there with her friend, Samantha, two women moving through the crowd, entirely unaware that the orbit of a predator was about to intersect with their own. Wade Wilson did not enter a room so much as he occupied it. Standing at a towering 6'6", his massive frame was a testament to a life spent in the pursuit of physical dominance. But it was his face that truly arrested the attention of the patrons, a landscape of dark ink, swastikas, and that chilling, tattooed, stitched smile. He was a visual manifestation of a society's deepest fears. Yet, when he approached Christine, he didn't radiate hostility. He radiated a calculated, magnetic stillness. He possessed a charisma that was as thick and suffocating as the Florida air, a way of leaning into a conversation that made the person he was talking to feel like the only inhabitant of the universe. As the drinks flowed, mostly mixed cocktails and the occasional beer, the interaction between Wade and Christine took on a life of its own. He told her that he was a man of diverse interests, a drifter who found beauty in the unconventional and the overlooked. He spoke about his tattoos not as symbols of aggression, but as artistic expressions of his internal turmoil. He was a master of the misunderstood soul narrative, a role he had perfected over years of manipulation in jails and on the streets. He told Christine and Samantha that he was just looking for a chance to relax and forget the weight of the world for a few hours. Christine was captivated. She saw past the ink and the looming shadow. She saw a man who seemed to be searching for a connection in a world that had rejected him. In her mind, the tattoos were likely just a mask, a defense mechanism for a man who had seen too much. She laughed at his jokes and matched his energy, her natural warmth providing a sharp contrast to the cold, ink-stained features of the man sitting across from her. They shared stories about their lives in Florida, the kind of superficial exchange that usually precedes a fleeting friendship. But for Wade, this was a hunt. He was observing her every reaction, noting the way she leaned in, the way she trusted him almost immediately. He later admitted to investigators that he found her easy to talk to, but that ease wasn't born of affection. It was born of her vulnerability. He liked that she wasn't afraid of him. To a man with his psychological makeup, a lack of fear was not a comfort. It was an invitation. It was a challenge to see how far he could push before the terror finally set in. As the clock ticked toward the early hours of Monday morning, the group decided to leave the bar. The transition from the loud, crowded interior of Buddha Live to the quiet, dark streets of Fort Myers was jarring. The heat was still there, a persistent reminder of the tropical latitude. They moved as a trio, Christine, Wade, and Samantha, making their way to Christine's home in Cape Coral. The drive was a blur of streetlights and darkened strip malls. The hum of the tires against the pavement, the only sound in the humid cabin of the car. Cape Coral is a city defined by its water, a labyrinth of over 400 miles of canals that wind through the residential neighborhoods like the veins of a giant organism. It is a place that usually feels safe, a quiet suburb where the only sounds at night are the rustle of the palms and the occasional splash of a fish in the brackish water. Christine's house was a modest, well-kept home, a sanctuary where she felt secure. She invited Wade and Samantha inside, the hospitality of the evening continuing into the pre-dawn hours. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted. The energy of the bar had faded, replaced by the intimate, low-light reality of a private residence. They sat in the living room, the air conditioning humming a steady, mechanical lullaby against the silence. They continued to talk, but the conversation grew more subdued. Wade's presence in the small space felt even more immense. His height nearly reaching the ceiling, his tattooed features casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Samantha, eventually feeling the weight of the late hour, decided it was time for her to head to her own home, leaving Wade and Christine alone. As the door clicked shut behind Samantha, a finality descended upon the house. The safety of the crowd was gone. The witness was gone. Christine, still under the spell of the night's excitement and the charm Wade had so carefully curated, felt no alarm. She saw a man who had been a gentleman all evening, someone who had listened to her and made her laugh. She didn't see the predator who was already beginning to detach from the persona he had been wearing for the last 5 hours. Wade stood in the middle of her living room, his eyes scanning the space. He wasn't looking at the decor or the photos on the mantle. He was looking for exits. He was looking for obstacles. He told her that he was tired, that he appreciated her opening her home to him. The words were polite, but the voice was flatter now, more monotone. The mask was beginning to slip, not into a look of rage, but into a look of absolute, chilling indifference. The house was quiet now. The only sound was the distant chime of a neighbor's wind chimes and the steady drip of a faucet. The Florida night was at its darkest, the hour when the line between a pleasant memory and a waking nightmare begins to blur. Christine Melton went to sleep that night, believing she had made a new friend. She had no way of knowing that the man she had invited into her sanctuary was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the moment when he would finally let the monster out. The Deadpool killer was no longer a name or a costume. He was a 6'6" reality sitting in her living room, waiting for the sun to never rise for her again. As the first faint light of October 7th began to bleed into the horizon, the interior of Christine Melton's home in Cape Coral remained a tomb of artificial coolness. The air conditioner hummed, a steady, mechanical drone that filled the silence of the bedroom. Christine lay in a deep, undisturbed sleep, the kind of heavy slumber that follows a night of social exertion and the warmth of a new connection. Beside her, Wade Wilson sat in the shadows. He wasn't sleeping. He was vibrating with a cold, predatory frequency. He later told investigators that there was no argument, no sudden flash of rage that prompted what happened next. He simply looked at the woman who had opened her home to him and decided that her life was a luxury he was no longer willing to permit. He leaned over her, his massive 6'6" frame casting a distorted ink-black shadow against the headboard. His hands, sculpted by years of heavy lifting and covered in the dark iconography of his own design, found their way to her throat. The physical disparity was staggering when his fingers closed around her neck. The silence of the room was shattered by the frantic, reflexive struggle of a human being realizing their air has been cut off. Christine's eyes snapped open, but she didn't find the misunderstood man from the bar. She found the void. She clawed at his forearms, her nails scraping against the tattooed swastikas and the stitches on his skin. But Wade was an immovable object. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. He maintained the pressure with a clinical, terrifying consistency, watching as the life force drained out of her. When the struggling finally stopped, he didn't immediately let go. He held her there, ensuring the stillness was permanent, before finally withdrawing his hands. The aftermath was not marked by panic, but by a chillingly mundane series of actions. Wade didn't flee into the night. He lingered. He took the keys to Christine's car, a blue Nissan Altima, and walked out of the house as if he were merely leaving for work. He drove away, the stolen engine purring through the quiet residential streets of Cape Coral. The sun was up now, the Florida heat beginning to bake the asphalt. Most people were starting their Mondays, pouring coffee, checking emails, unaware that a monster was navigating their morning commute. By the time Wade reached a different part of the city, his pulse was likely racing with the high of his first kill. He was a shark in a suburban sea. That's when he saw her. Diane Ruiz, 43 years old, a mother who worked 2 jobs to keep her family afloat. She was walking to work at the Moose Lodge because her own car was in the shop. She was walking along a stretch of Pine Island Road, a mundane journey she had made many times before. She was a woman of routine, a pillar of her community. And to Wade Wilson, she was simply the next opportunity. He rolled the Nissan Altima to a stop beside her. The window slid down with a soft, electric hiss. He leaned across the passenger seat, using that same magnetic, manipulative charm that had worked so well just hours before. He asked for directions, a simple, harmless request that preyed on Diane's innate helpfulness. She leaned toward the car, her mind likely on her shift and the tasks ahead. In one fluid, violent motion, Wade reached out and dragged her into the vehicle. The interior of the Nissan became a cage of violence. Diane didn't go quietly. She fought with the ferocity of a mother who knew she had everything to lose. She screamed. She kicked at the dashboard. She tried to lunge for the door handle, but Wade's strength was a wall she couldn't break. Inside the cramped cabin, the smell of old upholstery and stale air was punctuated by the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Wade told her to be quiet. He told her he just wanted to talk, but his hands were already moving toward her neck. He strangled her right there in the car. His massive frame pinned her against the seat as he squeezed. He felt her go limp, but he could still feel the stubborn, faint rhythm of her heart. She wasn't dead. Not yet. And for Wade, that wasn't enough. He drove toward a secluded, wooded area, a stretch of undeveloped land where the prying eyes of the city were replaced by tall weeds and the shadows of the palms. He stopped the car and pushed Diane's unconscious body out onto the dirt. The ground was dry, the dust kicking up around her as she lay there, gasping for the air he had stolen from her lungs. Wade got back behind the wheel. He later described this moment to his father with a lack of remorse that would eventually sicken the entire state of Florida. He didn't just want her to stop breathing, he wanted to destroy the vessel entirely. He shifted the Nissan into gear. He backed the car up, the engine revving, and then he floored it. The tires bit into the dirt, and then they hit something solid. He drove over her. Then he shifted into reverse and did it again. He repeated this cycle, driving forward and backward 10, 15, 20 times. He told his father later that he kept going until she looked like spaghetti. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch, a physical erasure of a human life. When he was finished, he didn't bury her. He didn't hide the evidence. He simply left her there in the weeds, a discarded piece of humanity, and drove away in a car that didn't belong to him, stained with the blood of two women who had done nothing but exist in his path. The heat of the afternoon was now at its peak. The humidity was a thick, suffocating blanket. Wade Wilson was driving through Lee County, the blue Nissan Altima, now a mobile crime scene. He had spent the morning snuffing out the light of two families, and as he drove, he wasn't looking for a place to hide. He was looking for his next audience. The Deadpool killer had finally completed his first act, and as he adjusted the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of that tattooed, stitched smile. For the first time, the mask on his face finally matched the reality of the man beneath it. He was no longer just a drifter with bad ink. He was a butcher who had turned a Monday morning in Cape Coral into a slaughterhouse, leaving a trail of spaghetti and broken dreams in his wake. The silence that followed the morning's violence in Cape Coral was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, static-filled void that began to vibrate as the sun climbed higher into the white-hot Florida sky. While the humidity rose from the asphalt in shimmering waves, the first ripples of a community-wide panic were starting to form. At Christine Melton's home, the blue Nissan Altima was conspicuously absent from the driveway. To a casual passerby, it looked like a typical Monday morning. But inside the cool, darkened walls of the residence, time had stopped. The search didn't begin with a siren. It began with the persistent, unanswered ringing of a telephone. Christine's friends and colleagues were the first to feel the chill. She was a woman of habit and connection, and when the hours began to slip past the start of the workday without a word from her, the concern shifted from annoyance to a deep, gut-level dread. A welfare check was requested, a standard procedure that usually ends with an embarrassed resident or a simple misunderstanding. But when the Cape Coral police officers arrived at the small, well-kept home, they found the front door locked and the interior swallowed by an unsettling stillness. When the authorities finally breached the threshold, the smell of the house hit them first, a mixture of cold, circulated air and the faint, sweet scent of something ending. They moved through the living room, noting the lack of a struggle. It looked like a home that had been lived in just hours before. Then, they reached the bedroom. The discovery of Christine Melton's body was a moment that would haunt the responding officers for years. She lay where she had been strangled, a stark, brutal contrast to the soft bedding and the quiet domesticity of her room. There was no signs of a break-in, no drawers rifled through for jewelry. This was not a robbery, this was an execution of the spirit. As the crime scene tape began to flutter in the salty breeze outside Christine's house, a second mystery was unfolding only a few miles away. At the Moose Lodge, the staff were looking at the entrance with growing confusion. Diane Ruiz was the reliable heartbeat of their team, a woman who walked to work through the heat because she refused to let her family down. But as the lunch rush approached, her station remained empty. Her family began to call. Her friends began to search the route she usually took along Pine Island Road. She had vanished, seemingly swallowed by the flat, palmetto-choked landscape of Lee County. The search for Diane Ruiz was a desperate, scorched earth effort. Detectives and volunteers fanned out across the undeveloped lots and the thickets of Brazilian pepper trees. The heat was punishing, the temperature soaring into the high 80s, making every step through the brush a physical battle. Information was scarce. Witnesses reported seeing a blue car, a Nissan, driving erratically in the area. But in a city defined by its sprawl and its thousands of similar vehicles, it was a needle in a haystack of chrome and glass. The void was the period of 48 hours where the police were working two seemingly unrelated cases. They had a murder in a bedroom and a missing person on a sidewalk. The bridge between these two tragedies was a name that had not yet been linked to the blood on the ground: Wade Wilson. While the search parties were scouring the woods for any sign of Diane's clothing or a discarded cell phone, Wade was still moving. He was navigating the county like a predator who had found a second wind. Surveillance footage from local businesses began to trickle into the precinct. In the grainy, low-resolution world of security cameras, a figure began to emerge. A man of immense stature. A man whose face was a blur of dark markings. The reports of a tall, tattooed man in a blue Nissan began to gain traction. The community, already on edge from the news of Christine's death, began to pull their children inside. The rumors were spreading faster than the official reports. There was a monster in a blue car, a man with a Deadpool name and a devil's face, and he was somewhere in the labyrinth of Cape Coral's canals. The frustration of the lead investigators was palpable. They were dealing with a man who had no permanent residence, no digital footprint that stayed in one place long enough to track. Wade was living in the spaces between the system, a drifter who had turned his invisibility into a weapon. The search for Diane took on a grim, resigned tone. The golden hour for finding a missing person alive had long since passed. The focus shifted from a rescue to a recovery. Every time a vulture circled over a vacant lot, the search teams held their breath. Every time a piece of trash caught the wind, hearts skipped a beat. The search was not just for the victims. It was for the logic behind the madness. Detectives were baffled by the lack of a clear motive. They were looking for a why in a case that seemed to be defined by "because I could." The social echo in Lee County was one of profound vulnerability. If a woman wasn't safe in her own bed, and a woman wasn't safe walking to work in broad daylight, where was the line of protection? The Deadpool moniker began to appear in the local media, a catchy pop culture label for a man who was proving to be a very real, very lethal threat. As the second night fell, the search for Diane Ruiz hit a wall of darkness. The woods became impenetrable, the shadows stretching out over the dirt where she had been repeatedly run over by the stolen Nissan. The void was total. Two families were now suspended in a state of agonizing grief and unanswered questions. The man they were looking for was still out there, his tattooed smile likely glowing in the dash lights of the stolen car, waiting for the moment when his own father would finally decide that the blood had to stop. The search was nearing its end, but the horror was only just beginning to be cataloged. The investigation into the disappearance of Diane Ruiz and the murder of Christine Melton did not conclude with a high-speed chase or a brilliant piece of forensic deduction. It ended with the heavy, trembling hand of a father holding a telephone. In Tallahassee, hundreds of miles from the carnage in Cape Coral, Stephen Testaseca sat in the mounting silence of his home. He had spent years watching his son, Wade, drift further into a sea of ink and instability. But nothing could have prepared him for the series of phone calls that began to bridge the distance between his quiet life and the nightmare unfolding in Lee County. When the phone first buzzed, Stephen saw his son's name on the screen. He answered, expecting perhaps another request for money or a rambling account of a minor brush with the law. Instead, he was met with a voice that sounded frighteningly alive, vibrant with a terrifying cold euphoria. Wade began to speak, and as he did, the air in the room seemed to thin. He told his father that he had become a killing machine. He spoke with a detachment that was more jarring than rage, explaining that he had decided to eliminate the people who crossed his path. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was reporting his achievements to the man who had tried to save him. Stephen listened in paralyzed horror as Wade detailed the events of the previous hours. His son described the moment he took Christine Melton's life in her own bed, telling Stephen that there was no specific reason for it other than the fact that he could. Then, the narrative shifted to the woman on the sidewalk. Wade spoke about Diane Ruiz with a level of cruelty that felt subhuman. He explained how he had lured her into the stolen Nissan, how he had strangled her, and then, the most sickening detail of all, he told his father that he had driven over her body repeatedly. He used the word spaghetti to describe what was left of her, bragging that he had crushed her until she was unrecognizable. As Wade spoke, Stephen realized the boy he had once held was gone, replaced by a creature that found amusement in the wet crunch of human bone. The father was faced with the ultimate, agonizing paradox: the duty of a parent versus the duty of a citizen. He knew that if he hung up, if he remained silent, more blood would inevitably follow. Wade told him he wasn't done yet, that he felt like he was living out a role that was always meant for him. Stephen made his choice, while keeping his son on the line, maintaining a facade of calm through the sheer force of will. He contacted the authorities. The coordination between Stephen and the Cape Coral Police Department was a masterclass in controlled desperation. Detectives in Lee County, who were still processing the grim crime scene at Christine's house, were suddenly handed the key to the entire mystery. They listened to the recordings of the calls, hearing Wade's boastful, flat-toned confession. The search for Diane Ruiz, which had been a blind crawl through the Florida brush, suddenly had a focus. Wade had given his father enough descriptions of the area, the high weeds, the secluded stretch of dirt, that the investigators could finally narrow their search. On October 8th, 2019, the active hunt for Wade Wilson came to a sudden, violent halt. Using the digital breadcrumbs of the stolen Nissan and the information provided by Stephen, the police tracked Wade to a business area in Fort Myers. He was cornered near a spa, standing beside the car that had become a rolling tomb. The arrest was a moment of high-tension stillness. Officers moved in with weapons drawn, their hearts hammering against their vests. Wade didn't resist with the ferocity one might expect from a killing machine. He seemed to simply surrender to the moment, his tattooed smile fixed in place as the handcuffs clicked shut over his massive wrists. But for the detectives, the arrest was only half of the mission. They still had to find Diane. Using the chilling directions Wade had shared with his father, search teams returned to the vacant lots along Pine Island Road. The heat was a physical weight as they pushed through the waist-high grass, the hum of insects, the only sound in the field. Then, they found the tire tracks, deep, jagged ruts in the dry earth where a car had been driven in a frantic, repetitive pattern. In the center of those tracks, they found the remains of Diane Ruiz. The scene was exactly as Wade had described it, a testament to a level of violence that defied typical criminal classification. The forensic recovery was a grueling, hours-long process. The investigators had to document the physical evidence of the vehicular assault, matching the tread patterns of the Nissan's tires to the marks on Diane's body. Every piece of clothing, every fragment of evidence, was a silent scream for justice. The spaghetti comment wasn't just a sick boast, it was a forensic reality. The investigation then pivoted to the cold, hard science of the crime scene. Inside the blue Nissan Altima, the technicians found a wealth of biological evidence. DNA from both Christine and Diane was present, a permanent link between the two victims and their killer. The void had been filled with the most damning evidence imaginable. The detectives sat in the interview room with Wade, watching him through the two-way mirror. He sat there with an unsettling calm, occasionally leaning back and adjusting his massive frame, seemingly bored by the gravity of the situation. When they confronted him with the details of his father's cooperation, Wade didn't display the betrayal of a son. He displayed the cold calculations of a predator who had finally been caged. He didn't deny the murders. In fact, he seemed to relish the attention. He was the center of a storm he had created, a man who had finally made the world look at the tattoos he had spent years carving into his skin. The Deadpool killer was now a matter of public record. The social echo in Cape Coral shifted from fear to a profound collective grief. The community began to learn about the victims, not as names in a police report, but as a mother who walked to work and a friend who loved to laugh. The investigation had revealed the how and the who, but the why remained a hollow space. Wade Wilson's father had delivered the monster to the gate, but the damage was already total. As the forensic teams packed up their kits and the crime scene tape was finally taken down, the reality of the trial ahead began to loom. The investigation was over, but the long, slow march toward a 2024 courtroom was just beginning. In June 2024, the 5-year wait for justice reached its peak in a Lee County courtroom. Wade Wilson entered not as a man seeking mercy, but as a spectacle of his own making. The ink had claimed even more of his scalp, and that tattooed, stitched smile remained a permanent, mocking fixture. Throughout the trial, he displayed a chilling, almost hypnotic lack of remorse, leaning back in his chair and even smirking at the cameras. The defense attempted to frame him as a broken machine, bringing in experts who spoke of significant brain damage and a cocktail of mental health struggles. They argued the monster was a product of a fractured biology. But the prosecution dismantled the narrative with the weight of his own words, the recorded calls where he bragged of his achievements. The jury wasn't moved by talk of damaged lobes. They were moved by the image of a woman run over until she was spaghetti. The verdict was final. The jury recommended death for both murders. Wade listened with a hollow stare, proving his malice was undeniable. The cameras have turned away, and the ink-stained spectacle of the Deadpool killer is finally fading into the sterile white of death row. But in the quiet canals of Cape Coral, the names that matter still echo. Christine Melton, a woman of warmth and laughter. Diane Ruiz, a mother who never stopped walking for her family. They are the reality. Wade Wilson is merely the hollow void that tried to swallow them. Justice is a slow, cold process. But for two families, the sun is finally beginning to set on the monster. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.